To try to get a sense of scale, let's imagine 8.2 billion humans fit on the face of a quarter, that 88 billion wild mammals take up the size of a credit card. For birds, let's say 200 billion would be a standard envelope. Reptiles and amphibians, somewhere around 2 trillion put together. A trillion would be a sheet of paper. And then 10 trillion fish, so a medium-sized desk. I think it is mind-boggling to imagine the number of invertebrates. So for those that live on land, estimates around 100,000 trillion. If 8.2 billion humans fit on the face of a quarter, 100,000 trillion would be the size of a FIFA regulation-sized soccer field. So you imagine standing at any point in a soccer field and looking at a quarter. Yeah, it really changes your perspective on who's really living here.
Hi, listeners. This is Luisa Rodriguez, one of the hosts of the 80,000 Hours podcast. Okay, so rationally, I know that there are incomprehensibly many wild animals in the world, and it seems totally possible to me that lots of their experiences cause them to suffer in ways that we would find tragic. We do find tragic when they happen in humans, burning alive in wildfires, dying of excruciating diseases, losing their young, starving. But the idea of meddling in nature or assuming what's good for wild animals has sometimes felt risky and overconfident at best, and totally irresponsible and intractable at worst. How are we supposed to know what it feels like to be a tree frog? And even if we did, could we actually help them without causing weird, unpredictable effects to other animals in the ecosystem, like the flies they eat? So I'm very excited to share with you the conversation I had with Cameron Meyer Shorb, the executive director of Wild Animal Initiative. He talked me through loads of concrete examples that really helped me understand both the scale of potential suffering, which is truly and utterly massive, and also some promising early approaches that this new research field is working on. For the first time since learning about the problem of wild animal suffering in 2017, I feel some hope that there are actual interventions that we might be able to implement to help wild animals without causing a bunch of these unpredictable side effects to other animals and the environment. And yeah, that we're kind of on track to identify even more interventions like that. So more specifically, Cam and I talk about how bad experiences like disease, parasites, and predation are for wild animals and how we can know, why it's so difficult to try to help alleviate suffering in nature without unintended consequences, and why Cam thinks we can make progress anyways, the pros and cons of potential interventions like selective reforestation, vaccines, fire management, and gene drives, plus loads more. So without further ado, I bring you Cameron Meyer Shorb. Today, I'm speaking with Cameron Meyer Shorb. Cam is the executive director of the Wild Animal Initiative, a nonprofit that supports cutting-edge research on wild animal welfare. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Cam. I've been wanting to do this for a while.
Thank you so much, Luisa. I'm a huge fan of the podcast and just so excited to be here and really excited to dive into this topic with you.
Nice. Okay, I want to dive into a question that really interests me, and then we'll come back to kind of setting up the problem of wild animal suffering. So for a long time, my biggest objection to arguments in favor of kind of wild animal suffering being a really big problem was around whether there was anything we could actually do about it. Like, what would we do if we realized that wild animals were suffering tremendously? Would we just eliminate nature? That seems drastic and just like not in line with my values. But my sense now is that you think that there are at least some things that would be robustly good to do to address some of the suffering in wild nature. Can you give just one example of an intervention that you think is just clearly good and doesn't require me to get on board with like just no more wild nature? It seems bad. let's get rid of it.
Yeah. I think first I'll just acknowledge that you are picking up on something very real here, which is that when we're talking about wild animal welfare, we're talking about a huge population of wild animals, and we do know shockingly little about how to help them. So that is most of the project right now, is figuring out what we can do and how to do it well. That being said, we definitely have ideas for what that might look like. One thing that I think is a good image to have in your mind as to what a scalable near-term intervention to help wild animals might look like could be selective reforestation. So the United Nations has a program originally called RED for incentivizing farmers to plant forests in their fields to sequester carbon, help mitigate climate change. It's now called RED Plus. The plus stands for, okay, now the program is not just about climate change, it's also about conservation and sustainable development. So they're encouraging communities to plant forests that will provide income streams to them. So you could imagine RED Plus Plus could be conservation, sustainable development, climate mitigation, and also wild animal welfare. Right. So when you're planting a forest in most regions of the world, there are several different kinds of forests you would be able to plant, several different stable states, you might call them. So you could maybe plant a forest that is primarily pine trees, or another that's primarily oak or some other broadleaf tree. And we already know that these types of forests support very different types of animals. So different species, different abundances of those species, different combinations of them. And we don't know right now exactly how to do this math, but you can imagine if we were able to make even very rough gestures at the total welfare of different animal populations, then we might be able to stack up the census of animal populations in each of these forestry options and make a guess at which of these options supports more animals living fulfilled, flourishing lives and leads to the existence of fewer animals that might suffer terribly. And then if you were to find the answer to that, then this is something that you could just incorporate into existing land management policy. You could scale it across huge regions. You could adapt it to different circumstances. And it does require more empirical knowledge and methodologies than we have right now, but it doesn't require any new technology.
Yeah, I love that. I hadn't heard that as a potential intervention at all before. And I feel super, super excited about it. I know I'm putting you in a tough position by asking this, but do you have any guesses, even if they're, really early ones, about which ecosystems might have the most flourishing in them, or which ecosystems might have the most suffering in them?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. As I think we'll get into later, there are a couple crucial uncertainties that could push things either way. I think the way to proceed on something like this without having to answer every question there is to ask about wild animal welfare would probably be to start by finding two systems that are fairly similar, except for one key component. So maybe we find that two types of forests tend to host similar amounts of similar kinds of insect life and similar amounts of similar kinds of bird life, but one is much more amenable to mammal life. Then at least we could kind of narrow down the scope of the questions we're asking and research the particulars and make a informed guess there. And I guess that's the last thing I'll say is that in a lot of domains, it's helpful to do these back the envelope calculations or broad guesses. What are the generalities? But I think in the context of wild systems and ecology, one thing that comes up again and again is that the particulars matter. And you often just can't make generalizations that sweep worldwide. A lot of what ecology is the game of trying to figure out when do things generalize from one system to another? What are the rules here? But kind of the default expectation is that you won't know everything before you look at the specifics.
Yeah. I feel tempted to, force you to name, I don't know, the tundra seems pretty bad, but I also think, it's probably an area that requires a bunch of caution in how you talk about things and is probably way more complicated than it sounds. So for now, I just really like that I think I just haven't heard of an example intervention that feels that divorced from spillover effects. So that feels really exciting to me. We'll come back to more interventions that you feel excited about. But first, let's talk more about this as a problem. Fundamentally, why do you worry about suffering among wild animals? I guess, what kinds of things make you think that they might be suffering a lot in particular?
So I'm wildly uncertain about what the nature of wild animals' lives are like, but I got into this field because I changed my mind about the possibilities here. I used to just assume that animals living in the wild were perfectly in balance and living totally fulfilled lives and weren't bothered by any of the stresses of modernity like I am, and that the best thing humans could possibly do for them is just leave them alone there. But the more I learned about it and thought about it, the more I realized that there's actually lots of reasons to think that wild animals might not be living great lives, at least many of them. So, for example, they often have to struggle to get enough food. They often need to struggle to protect themselves from extreme weather. There are some kinds of things where they have no protection at all, right? If a flood or a wildfire comes, that's just the end of it for them. There's also, all sorts of disease or parasites. They have no healthcare. They also have no state to protect them from violence, either from other species or even members of their own species. So the kinds of conditions we're talking about here, would humans live in those conditions, we would call that poverty, and we wouldn't tolerate that. We would say that those are problems we need to solve. Those are people who deserve better lives. And if we have medicine, we should help give them access to medicine. If there's ways to give them more stable access to food, that's something that would improve their lives. That's the kind of approach that I now think we should consider taking when we think about wild animals, is taking seriously the idea that they might be struggling even in their natural habitats, and they might suffer even from naturally occurring harms. And we should try to figure out to what extent that's true and if it's possible to do anything about that.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of those because I feel like even though I'm a little bit familiar with this problem, I still have a super limited imagination for the kinds of things that animals, and obviously there's such a wide range across different species, but the kinds of things that wild animals might be going through, aside from like the really obvious one, being eaten or something. So putting a pin in that, what is the scale of the problem? How many individuals alive right now are wild animals?
The scale is huge. It's bigger than I can count. I've been humbled by learning about this, but I do think the scale is such an important part of understanding the problem. Just in the broadest possible strokes, based on the rough numbers we know, it looks like something like 99% of all sentient minds alive on Earth today are wild animals. And so if you are a human or a farmed animal, that is an incredibly rare exception to the rule, which is things that can feel live in the wild. More of a rounding error than anything, which is not to say that human and farmed animal experiences aren't important. It's just to say there is a lot more going on, and a truly impartial view of ethics would have us believe that ethics is mostly about wild animals, and also there are these interesting subfields related to some primates and farmed animals.
Okay. I'm interested in breaking down the numbers a bit more. I feel like it seems at least kind of important to know, are we mostly thinking about zebras, or are we mostly thinking about fish, ants? And what to think about feels like it could have at least helpful effects in helping me figure out, what are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask, because I think that the images that normally come to mind are not the most representative of wild animals. Most minds are wild, weird, and wet. They're just not humans or human-like things. So to try to get a sense of scale, I'll try to suggest a visualization. Let's imagine, for the sake of this exercise, that we're going to put a dot down of equal size for any individual that's alive. So 1 dot for a human, 1 dot for a squirrel. And you can debate later how you want to make trade-offs across species, but just for starters, to get a sense of the raw numbers. Now, let's make these dots small enough so that we can fit all 8.2 billion humans onto the face of a quarter or a euro. So something a little smaller than 1 square inch. If we're keeping that scale, then the 88 billion wild mammals would take up an area about the size of a credit card or a Post-it note. And then when we move on to birds, and I should say these estimates are all very rough, and the bigger the populations, the wider the error bars are. But for birds, let's say there are about 200 billion living in the wild. That would be something about the size of a standard envelope. And then for reptiles and amphibians, each of those numbers somewhere around 1 trillion individuals, so 2 trillion put together. And so a trillion would be a standard sheet of paper. So I think this is a good place to pause and just think about how far we've come from a quarter to an envelope, which is way bigger than a quarter, to a couple sheets of paper, compared to a quarter that contains all of human experience and 8.2 billion lives. There's that times many, many more if you're trying to encompass humans and mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians. And then the numbers get even more mind-boggling when we move on to fish. There's something like 10 trillion fish in the world. So 10 trillion fish would be something like the size of a medium-sized desk. So the limnon from IKEA, if you will, or a large bath mat, or a couple of pillowcases, maybe. That's what the whole fish population would look like relative to the human population fitting on a quarter. And the numbers get really, I don't know what to boggle means literally, but I think it is something like what is happening to my mind. I think it is mind-boggling to try to imagine the number of plausibly sentient invertebrates. So the only at all close to useful number I've found here is an estimate of the number of terrestrial arthropods. So that would be animals with hard exoskeletons like insects and arachnids and crustaceans. So for those that live on land, estimates are that their population is somewhere around 100,000 trillion, which if 8.2 billion humans fit on the face of a quarter, 100,000 trillion would need to be something the size of a city block or a FIFA regulation size soccer field. So imagine standing at any point in a soccer field and looking at a quarter and then looking around at the rest of the field. It really changes your perspective on what life on Earth is like, who's really living here. And it's hard to know whether many arthropods are sentient. I think there's like decent questions and considerations on either side. But one of the things that I think is important to consider there is just sort of the expected value. So even if there's just, say, a 10% chance that they are, 10% of a soccer field is still way bigger than a quarter.
Yeah, this makes me really happy that some of our most recent episodes, one is with Megan Barrett, one of my favorite episodes of all time on invertebrate sentience. And really, I mean, it took me well above 10% probability or whatever credence that invertebrates are sentient. And another one is on fish with Sebastian Morrow. And it's just infinite numbers of kind of bewildering facts about fish that, again, for me, the invertebrates and fish both make up tremendous numbers of individuals, as you've just said, and just are clearly, I mean, at least very, very plausible sentience candidates. For the case of fish, it seems hard to even debate for me. So given that these are the animals making up most of the wild nature we're talking about, anyone who's interested, I can recommend those episodes. Can you say more about what we know about what it's like to be a wild animal?
So first, two big caveats. One, there's a huge diversity of wild animals. That's one of the things that makes this field so fun to work in, is that there's just all these different ways of surviving in the world. Two, for each of those types of animals, there's, of course, way less research than we would like there to be on the specifically welfare-relevant questions of what does it feel like to them to live their lives, and what are the most common outcomes for them of different scenarios, etc. So having said that, to sort of practice getting out of some of the assumptions that I think we normally make, maybe I can use a frog as an example of a wild animal for us to think about, right? So many of us think about wild animal. First one that comes to mind is some sort of large African mammal we've seen on National Geographic, right? But as we talked about with the numbers, reptiles and amphibians outnumber other land vertebrates by an order of magnitude or two. So yeah, let's choose a frog, choose a generic frog. Sorry, frogs, for not knowing your names better. I would like to get to know my neighbors better, but that's what we have to work with. So first thing is many wild animals are born in great numbers. So in the case of frogs, there's many eggs, sometimes a couple hundred or a couple thousand eggs for one parent per year. And then those eggs hatch into tadpoles. So one of the first things that we want to know about what it's like to be a wild animal is, what is it like to be a juvenile wild animal? Because every wild animal is going to be juvenile. Not all of them are going to make it to adulthood. In fact, the majority of juveniles I would say the majority of animals, in terms of total headcount, the majority of juveniles don't make it to adulthood. And so a lot of what it is to be a frog is what it is to be a tadpole. So the next sorts of things we would want to know are, what's the daily life like for an animal of a given type in a given life stage in a given area? So for tadpoles, what are they eating? What do they need to do to find shelter? Are they avoiding predators? Are there pathogens? So what are their main needs? How are they meeting them? And what are the major threats? And how common are those? And how intense are those? One of the ways that we are exploring to very roughly model wild animal welfare is with these life history charts. So life history in biology refers to broadly the life stages an animal goes through and the amount of offspring they have and at what ages they tend to die, those kinds of things. So we'd like to add more color to those by asking these kinds of questions of when they do die, what are they dying of? How painful are those causes of death relative to each other? And for their good days, what are those days like?
Cool. Yeah. Do we have that for frogs?
We do have that for some frog species and not for others. I'll note just on the diversity point, most frog species that I know of take this approach of having a whole ton of offspring that they don't have any parental care. They let go off, survive in the wild. And this is a sort of high risk, high reward approach to trying to pass your genes on. But even for frogs, that's not always true. There are some poison dart frogs, for example, that will lay just like 3 to 6 eggs in a tiny puddle in a leaf in a rainforest. And then when those hatch, they will put the little tadpoles onto their backs, and then they stay there with a sort of mucus covering, and then they climb all the way up to a tree to a little puddle inside a certain kind of plant, and they put the tadpoles back there, and then they come back every day to feed them bugs. So humans have a similar kind of approach to child rearing, and I just think it's neat that some frogs do that too. Not to be too speciesist, but I do think that a life history in which there's lower infant mortality is likely to be a life history that tends to have higher welfare because you just have a lower ratio of death to minutes lived.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay, so there's the juvenile stage, which in some frogs will look like actual parenting of some kind, rearing by a parent. And then there's some juveniles that are being left to their own devices and maybe more likely to die as a juvenile. I feel like there are two risks here. One is anthropomorphizing, and there I'm at a point where my tendency is probably to overly anthropomorphize. And I have this vision of this mother frog putting the little frogs on her back and caring about them and wanting all of them to make it to the tree and wanting them not to be hungry and wanting none of them to die and maybe feeling something like loss or panic or dread if their young are being threatened. And then there's also this other risk, which is maybe that mother is doing something very robotic and reflexive. Maybe, I don't know, I have this sense that sea turtles like do this thing by bringing their eggs onto a beach, and that behavior seems incredibly, incredibly ingrained and old and less about choices and like strong emotions, though I'm obviously completely making this up. But it seems like you could imagine it being true that a mother frog is doing something more like that. They're just like, this is just what I do. These are the rules that have been programmed into my brain by evolution. How worried about each of these risks are you?
I think they're both worth worrying about. There are times when we anthropomorphize too much and project things onto animals and don't do a good job listening or observing or asking. And then we miss important parts of their experience. And then there are times when we are too reluctant to assign to them emotions like the ones we have. I'm really glad that you mentioned the idea of imagining some animals as robotic automatons. I think as much debate as there is, and there is a lot of debate within behavioral ecology and animal psychology and related disciplines, there's a lot of debate around when anthropomorphism is appropriate or what constitutes anthropomorphism, etc. If there are any generalities to be made about how and when to apply it, my guess is that it's most useful when you're using anthropomorphism as a way to generate hypotheses about what the richness of an animal's interior life might look like, and least useful when you are trying to use it to make specific assumptions about what that animal must feel like. So in the sea turtle example, you're totally right. Many sea turtles have this life history where they come to a particular beach. Most of these sea turtles will return to the same beach year after year, and they lay eggs. So in the case of green sea turtles, this is often in the range of 50 to 150 eggs. And then the mother sea turtle leaves. She buries the eggs so that they're protected. The mother leaves. Some number of weeks later, the eggs hatch, and each of them, totally on their own, with no help from the parent, has to make it to the sea. So it would be, I think, too anthropomorphizing to imagine that mother sea turtle leaving the beach is feeling her heart absolutely rendered by having to leave her babies behind. Like, that just doesn't really make sense for them. That's not a motivation that would be useful for her lifestyle. But she might have a different kind of feeling, which is upon coming to the beach, there might be a kind of yearning or anticipation, or maybe it's anxiety, or maybe it's thrill, but there's probably something that it feels like to want to go back to that beach, to cross huge stretches of ocean, to go to one particular place. And then there's probably something that it feels like to have done that job and to leave and to go back to your own life, and now to only have to feed your own body and not have to carry all those eggs around. So I think the comparisons to human experience can be useful for generating hypotheses about what kinds of things might it feel like to do this behavior. But then we shouldn't narrow in on any one of those without more evidence from the animal's behavior or their physiology or any number of ways we might collect indicators for their welfare.
Yeah. Okay. I really like that. I really like the idea of using, I don't know, the anthropomorphism to generate hypotheses, but then not anchoring too hard on them. I guess to help us kind of generate some intuitive hypotheses, even if we don't necessarily take them too seriously, Can you say more about the ways in which wild animals might suffer? I think when I first started learning about this topic, I had a very specific picture in mind when I imagined wild animal suffering. It was something like a pack of lions taking down a baby wildebeest, so predation. And now I have the impression that there's actually a wide range of things that wild animals probably experience that might be causing them to suffer or might be causing them joy. Yeah, does that sound right? And if so, what categories of experiences should I be thinking of?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have an exhaustive list, but I tend to think of it in terms of how do they live and how do they die? So how do they live? How do they meet their basic needs? Like what kind of food do they eat? How abundant is that? How easy is that to get? Part of that is like the actual experience of grazing or hunting or foraging. And part of it is also about the abundance of food, which is not just a like fixed absolute value, but also a feature of the amount of competition with other members of the same species or other species. So yeah, how hard is it to get food? How hard is it to avoid exposure to the weather? I think this is something that people might underestimate about the difficulty of living in the wilds, because we think animals are just like born with the perfect raincoats or whatever, and they have everything they need all the time. But many animals need to navigate a range of environments, a range of, weather events, and they can do it, but it's, a matter of getting under the bark at the right time or getting to the right side of the mountain or something. And so how hard is that to do, and what happens when you don't do it? Other kinds of experiences during life can be, what are your experiences like when you interact with other species? So interactions with other members of the same species. As humans, we tend to have positive interactions. We're social animals. Many animals are primarily solitary and interact with other members of their own species primarily to compete or to defend territory. And then, of course, there's mating, which can be, there's a whole range, I think, of ways that can be for wild animals, because there's such a wide range of reproductive systems, some of which I think are pretty pleasurable to undergo, some of which I think are pretty excruciating. And then there's interactions with other species. So that could be competition with other species for food. It could, of course, be predation or preying upon other animals. And that kind of gets into the other big bucket of types of causes of suffering. And that's things that could cause death or dramatically decrease animals' health. So disease is a big one that can come from pathogens or from parasites. Again, looking at weather, there can be extreme weather events like fires or storms or floods. And then there can be predation. So what kinds of predators are there? How stressful is it to avoid those predators when you are getting eaten? What is that experience like? How long does it last? What are the physiological reactions to that experience? So I don't know that I've hit them all, but that I think is a brief survey of the types of things that we think about and like to ask questions about.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Are there other kind of key, again, just hypotheses for what the suffering might be constituted by that I'm missing that you think are especially important?
I might create one more category, which is just other or things that are hard to relate to as humans. Maybe this would probably be something like frustration of goals. So for animals that migrate, could be the case that not being able to migrate or being confused about where they're going could be very stressful. Yeah, I don't really know for an electric eel living in murky water, what the most uncomfortable things are, but I would not be surprised if it's something that I couldn't have thought of on my own without asking the eel. So I think we should, leave space for that.
Yeah. Okay, maybe let's talk about some more specifics. What are some of the ways that wild animals die?
Yeah, I think of them loosely in two categories. One is the slow ways of dying, and one is the faster ways of dying. So the slower ways of dying for many wild animals would be things like dying of starvation or dying of the cold, or many kinds of disease, some kinds of poison take days or weeks to take effect. So those are all things where I think the experience is often one of being a weakened, sickly state for days or weeks. And then those often end up increasing an animal's chance of dying from some of the quicker causes of death, which are not necessarily quick enough for any of them to sound particularly fun. Foremost among these is predation, which, despite our, I think, kind of go-to mental image of lions attacking a wildebeest, more often looks like a much bigger animal swallowing a much smaller animal whole. And then other faster deaths could be forms of accidents or injuries. So dying of collisions with vehicles is pretty common for many animals in many parts of the world. And then there's things like other extreme weather events. So being burned alive in a fire or drowning in a flood, things like that.
Yeah, I find I really have to think about it to kind of really understand how bad these might be. Like even dying of, I don't know, like a disease or poison or hunger, I somehow have this intuition that's like, surely it can't be that bad because it happens so often and it's so natural. And then obviously we don't know exactly how human experiences of these things differ from wild animal experiences of these things. But even if it's just a tiny glimpse at what it would be like, I hate being like normal sick with the flu, like that sucks. But being ill enough to die is horrific. And yeah, I feel like I need to like really actually just sit with that and not let my mind do gymnastics to be like, yeah, probably these things aren't that bad because then that would be terrible. That would bode really, really badly for wild animal existence.
I do think there's one potential reassurance there, the goal of which is not to reassure ourselves, but to try to maintain as much as possible a evidence-backed approach to imagining what wild animals' lives might be like. And this is discussed in a great paper by Heather Browning and Walter Veit on positive wild animal welfare. They're basically presenting a whole bunch of arguments for why life in the wild might not be as bad as we think it is. So really great paper, highly recommended it. One of the things they point out is that a reasonable hypothesis for the evolutionary value of pain is that it often seems to direct animals to take action, especially so like pain of a wound would direct an animal to pay attention to that wound, to not put too much pressure on that foot, to try to clean it, things like that. Those actions are often not the actions that are relevant in the actual moment when you're escaping from a predator. And so it might be that there's a shock response that protects animals from the intense pain we would otherwise expect from having those kinds of wounds in that moment. And that's reflective of experiences that humans report of being in a car crash or bitten by a crocodile or all sorts of things where people have reported that they were aware that there was a huge gash in their leg and they knew it was bad, but it was not actually a pain sensation. They were mostly just entirely focused on getting out of there. And then once they got out of there, then the pain washes over them.
Okay. Yeah, no, that does feel reassuring. I guess probably some wild animals do kind of escape an attack and then have that and then also not have hospitals. I also just have this sense that like it's true that at the end of some long, terrible diseases, humans seem to be less conscious of the suffering those diseases are causing them. But I feel like for most diseases, like humans still need loads of morphine and other medicinal intervention to not make it literally torturous. So I only feel, maybe I feel reassured for like some subset of cases where like shock is probably a really useful thing to experience. Which I guess makes me curious, what do we have any idea like what the most common way to die is? Is it mostly these shock predation things, or is it mostly disease and parasites and hunger?
I think the best resource that we found so far on causes of death is this paper on cause-specific mortality of the world's terrestrial vertebrates. That's by Hill and colleagues in 2019. And it was a meta-analysis of all the studies they could find on this question of what do different animals die of. It was entirely or almost entirely terrestrial animals and entirely vertebrates. But at least for the ones they studied, predation was the largest cause of death for the majority of the taxa that they studied. So like 50 to 90% of most groups. So yeah, I do think that's something we need to consider. I do think it's important to, again, check our image of what predation looks like for small animals, especially juveniles of small animals. It might not be, being torn apart by a pack of wolves, but rather just being gulped by a bird or a bigger fish or something.
Which also sounds terrible to me. Like, I was listening to a podcast about owls recently, and it was saying that they also consume their prey whole. And I was like, wow, maybe they're being digested by stomach acid. And that sounds maybe worse to me than having, I don't know, some important artery clawed through and then quickly dying through like blood loss or something. So yeah, I find this idea that actually many small animals might be gulped whole really actually quite awful.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I feel like I was taking on something of a dismissive tone. This doesn't mean things are fine. It means things might be different than we think, and we definitely don't know how they are. But yeah, being dissolved by stomach acid might be terrible. There might be other circumstances in which being swallowed whole means that you are quickly crushed or that you suffocate maybe before you fully dissolve. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of stomach acid in the mix, and that's probably pretty terrible. So yeah, predation's a tricky issue. I guess I do also want to say that even if it turns out to be one of the biggest causes of suffering in the wild, it is still one of the hardest, if not the hardest, problem to solve, simply because we have found that when you remove or reduce predator populations, that is one of the scenarios that most reliably causes lots of indirect effects in ecosystems. And so that'd be a particularly risky move. And it's also a case of trade-offs between one animal species who's very likely to be sentient and another animal species who's very likely to be sentient, as opposed to when animals are simply suffering from weather conditions or viruses or an absence of food. These are not direct trade-offs. There's just no winners in that situation. So yeah, I guess I often want to push people in the direction of thinking about other areas of wild animal suffering, but seeing this meta-analysis of the research that's been done so far was a helpful reminder to me that predation still might be a huge cause of suffering, whether or not we can do anything about it soon.
Yeah. How confident do you think we can be about stuff like this?
So that's really our first glimpse into what these things look like. But cause of death is something that is really not understood, as it not received as much attention historically as I would like it to, given its importance to wild animal welfare. But also, even if you are trying to do the best wild animal welfare science you can, it's a really hard thing to study because dead animals are often not around anymore, right? So like it's just something where you either need to be there to witness it or you need to have some way of estimating the frequency. And it's really hard to know, even when you do collect data, to what extent your data is representative or if there's sampling bias. There's really every reason to think there will be sampling bias and that some kinds of causes of death will be easier to detect than others. So everything we claim to know about wild animal welfare, we need to take with a grain of salt. This is a particularly big chunk of salt.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it wouldn't have occurred to me to wonder how we figure out how wild animals die. But when I try to put it together for myself, I'm like, wow, so do you have to go looking for wild animal carcasses and then do autopsies or guess based on things you can see about them? And then even then, like even finding the carcasses sounds hard. That feels extremely hard and is giving me a bit of a glimpse into how hard scientists in this field must find their work. Yeah, are there other things that if you imagine being reborn as a random animal in the wild, you would be like, ugh, like that, like X experience is gonna, I'm really not, yeah, I'm dreading. I really am not looking forward to.
I don't know how representative this is of the frequencies or risks out there, but I do worry a lot about parasites and pathogens. Right? So animals have no health care whatsoever, except for sometimes their own knowledge of medicinal plants or things like that, which has been observed in several species. But many animals have just really high parasite loads to a degree that most modern humans just never experience. So, for example, I was just reading a study about moose in northwestern Minnesota that found the primary cause of death was one of several parasites. One that's like a parasite on the liver. Increasingly now with climate change, moose are dying from tick infestations where they are just covered in so many ticks that juveniles will need to replace over half of their blood, and they'll die. Like the proximate cause is starvation or malnutrition, but it's because they just have literally thousands of ticks draining blood off of them. And I mentioned before the dangers of over-indexing on large, unusual animals, but this is something that we do see at lots of different scales. I have friends who put in a lot of time rescuing injured pigeons and rats in the city, and they say they find lots of ectoparasites on them as well. So yeah, that's something that I worry about quite a bit. As we've discussed, it's super hard to just blindly apply our intuitions at how bad something might be and reliably get the answer. But one, I don't know, kind of guiding principle there might be like thinking about the adaptive value of feeling pain or not feeling pain in certain circumstances. And when I think about hunger or starvation, for example, that seems like something where I can imagine animals having just developed a high tolerance for temporary absences of food. Even humans can do this in certain circumstances. But parasites seem like the kind of thing where they're like just abnormal enough that they might cause continuous suffering, and it might not be the kind of thing you get used to. And then they might last long enough that they could cause a lot of suffering over time. My understanding is that when you ask people to estimate how bad different ailments would be, and then when you survey people with those ailments, people tend to way overestimate how bad something like losing an arm is, and way underestimate how bad something like having chronic low-level back pain is. So parasites and pathogens could fit in that category of something that might just linger for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Are there any other kind of key ailments I should be imagining when I imagine having a parasite?
Yeah, I think parasites can get really, really nasty. And I haven't even done the most research into this, but if you ever talk to someone who has, like, just the look on their face when they start talking about parasites makes you think maybe I don't want to read what they've read. But yeah, there are just so many ways to break down a body slowly, and parasites have found many of those advantageous to them. So there's burrowing into skin, there's right, depriving them of nutrients, there's getting into the nervous system, which can directly cause pain or can cause animals to do painful things. Yeah, so maybe that's part of it too. And in this case, it's honestly just really hard for me to tell how much I'm like reacting to evidence and how much I'm just kind of gripped by a gut level horror at the bizarreness of these things. But the sheer diversity of ways that parasites seem to cause tremendous amounts of pain makes them something that I worry about a lot when we think about animals in the wild.
Oof. Oh, yeah. Okay, how common is starvation? I guess there's like starving to death, but there's also just being very, very hungry for a long time, but in a way that doesn't necessarily kill you, at least kind of acutely?
Yeah, I do think that not having enough food is probably quite a common occurrence. We know that there are populations that are top-down regulated, which is to say that the size of the population is limited by the amount of predation that happens. And the reason there aren't more animals is because they're getting predated upon, or there are other causes of death. But there's also a pretty common occurrence, which is bottom-up regulation, which is when the population is limited by the amount of resources they have available to them. So it might be the case that you have a stable population, and what's keeping it stable is that animals are starving at a rate that's high enough that it matches up with the fertility rate, and you're shrinking as much as you're growing, and that's what is keeping the population stable. I think for me, what the big question mark here comes from is not only just the frequency of this, but what animals' subjective experience of this is, because you can imagine variety of experiences, right? It might be that the gnawing, constant, intense sensation of hunger is something that drives animals to seek food more. It might be the case that animals don't feel as much pain from hunger if it's something that they do regularly encounter. I think it's really interesting how much humans vary on this. Sometimes people of different cultures or religious practices will practice fasting, and I will be in intense hunger pain after 6 hours, and other people can go 10 days before they feel that kind of thing. So I'm not sure how bad it is, but it does seem like it's quite common, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is quite bad.
Yeah. On the one hand, it seems like discomfort and pain are probably really important for motivation, and probably motivation to keep searching for food is really, really helpful. On the other hand, very sustained, intense pain doesn't seem that helpful. And now I'm just really talking outside of my expertise here. But I guess, yeah, it does seem like a case where I can imagine things going either way. Is there a category that has to do with social stress? I don't know, I feel like I've got a few bits and pieces that I know about at least some species. Like chickens have very defined social hierarchies, and it seems like a big source of suffering for some chickens in some environments is literally the pecking order, and how that affects their lives. It seems like social hierarchies is a common thing, and maybe it just isn't something that's super intuitive to people to think about, but social hierarchies certainly define a lot of how my experience is.
Yeah, I think you're totally right that for animals that live in groups, particularly set groups that stay together, social interactions are a huge part of their welfare. And I think there's some of those kinds of experiences that are very relatable to us. Like you mentioned chickens, among a flock, there being a pecking order that's established by acts of aggression and bullying, and then sort of repeated low-level bullying to maintain that order. I think that's somewhat easy for us to imagine. Then I also think this is a great example of one of those areas where we need to be careful to not overlook the positive experiences that wild animals undergo. So relatively recently, there's been more research coming out about animal friendship, basically tracking birds, for example, where if you track a whole flock of birds or a population of birds, basically if you do anything other than put little bands on them and keep very careful track of exactly where each individual goes, you'll miss the fact that in a flock of pretty similar looking birds, they don't disperse themselves randomly. They often, at least for some of the species that have been observed, demonstrate patterns of consistently foraging near another one, who's not a member of their family, who's not a potential mate. And then there's also been evidence of these bonds being sustained over time and over huge amounts of distance, right? So in migratory sparrows that go a couple thousand miles for the winter and then come back a couple thousand miles in the summer, they're back with their same buddy. And, they might have made that whole trip with their buddy. And so that could be a very nice thing. Losing friends could be a very hard thing. Those are some of the experiences that I think are particularly relatable. I also think it's important to hold space for the social experiences that might be harder to relate to. One thing that comes to mind here is seals who have a mating social system wherein there's one dominant bull seal who establishes a harem, that's the technical word, a harem of females that he defends against from all other males. And so what ends up happening is the vast majority of males don't get to mate. Lions have a similar mating system. That might feel like a just extreme form of inceldom that is hard for most humans to relate to, because these males will then have to, this isn't something they just like give up and accept. This is something they will go back and fight to try to take over these harems and win the opportunity to reproduce. And these fights can be extremely damaging and sometimes deadly. So yeah, if you are so deprived of the ability to have sex that you would fight and risk your life for it, maybe that's something we can relate to, and maybe it's not. I just think there's many different kinds of animal social interactions, and for the animals who do live in groups, I think that probably is a huge component of their welfare.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Because you hinted at positive experience, yeah, I wonder if a lot of what we've been talking about, death, illness, some negative social interactions, makes up a small or large fraction of animals' lives. Like, is it mostly just kind of boringly grazing, or is it, mostly kind of enjoyably grazing next to your friend? Or is it mostly, like, is there a lot of time spent very hungry, very cold, very wet, or grieving the death of your child or buddy?
Yeah, again, hard to make generalizations about, but I think it is important to remember that the intense negative events that we're thinking about happen in the context of a whole life, and that I think it's quite likely that there are many sources of happiness in that life. And there's also, I think, a lot of, I don't know what to call it, downtime maybe for many animals. It's something that strikes me all the time when I'm observing pretty much any kind of animal in the wild, is they just spend a lot of time doing nothing, or at least what looks like nothing, like just sort of sitting there. You see this, like, on the beach, you'll see a flock of seagulls just sitting and looking into the wind, and that's just what they're doing. And I don't know if that feels boring, if they're feeling like mildly anxious that they don't have food, or is that just kind of like the equivalent of sitting on the porch chatting with your buddies? Like, is that a, just mild, nicely valenced experience? And maybe it's more than mild. Maybe the experience of just not needing to run from anything or not needing to get any food, and knowing that you can just sit there, maybe that feels really good. So yeah, we really don't know. I do think a important part of understanding animals' lives will be applying our emerging methodologies of estimating welfare to try to construct these sort of lifetime time budget schematics, right, where we roughly break it down into how much time do they spend in what kinds of states, how good or bad are those kinds of states. That at least can give us a structure to our research agenda.
How much wild animal experience do you think might be neutral or positive? I guess neutral, I'm kind of suspicious that much experience is neutral. I don't have very many perfectly neutral experiences, but like benign-ish or positive.
Yeah, I'm interested by your sense that you don't have many neutral experiences. I feel like a lot of my experiences are close to neutral. Like, I have a little mood journal that I fill in each day, and at the end of the day, I think, like, was that a good day? And I'm often like, and I have to think for a couple moments. So maybe that's a matter of things outweighing each other. As with almost all things wild animal welfare, I have huge uncertainty here. But I think part of the uncertainty I've discussed before about painful experiences, it it goes the other way too, is like, if those things are not as painful as they think, there might actually just be way more experiences or much larger expanse of time spent in states that are somewhat close to neutral, maybe only slightly negative, or maybe slightly positive, or maybe very positive. So when I think, for example, about a rabbit grazing in a field, I can imagine that occupying almost the full range of states, right? So rabbits are extremely vulnerable to predators. They'll like perk their ears up at the slightest disturbance. That's because there really is a very high risk that they'll die that day, and they need to be ready to run for their life. So maybe that feels like terror, and maybe they're like constantly on guard. I will say my best guess is that they're not constantly at full terror mode, because that seems like it would not leave you much room to dial up the dial more if you needed to. So maybe it's something more like commuting in a car on a particularly rainy day or something, when like the roads are slippery and you're kind of like stressed and you're doing the thing you normally do each day, but it is tricky, and like you do know there's a risk that like you could die if you fuck this up. So try to keep your eyes on the road. Maybe that's what it feels like to be a rabbit grazing in a field. It's like, all right, this is my thing, like this is my work, I got to do it, but there are real risks here, so don't get sloppy. And I can also imagine it being at the very far end of like a quite pleasant thing. Sometimes when I get to lie in a field in the sunlight and eat food, it's very, very nice. And, that's primarily because these are like leisure times, or at least I think that's primarily because these are leisure times in a extremely leisurely, exceptionally privileged life. But, when you talk to people living in conditions where they have much less material wealth, people are often surprised at how much day-to-day happiness they still have. So it could be the case that a rabbit's experience is there are moments of terror, but that the baseline is a sort of like satisfaction that they are doing the thing that they want to do. And I think rabbit populations are one of those populations where they're, to the extent that they're limited by food availability, it's probably winter food availability. And in the summer, there's just more food than they could ever eat. And so they're kind of feasting all the time. That might be really nice. It might be nicer than the lives you and I lead, where we're like kind of constantly stressed about doing our work and how bad we should feel about that.
Yeah, what do we do with all of that uncertainty? Do we have any way of kind of knowing whether a rabbit's experience of grazing in a field is more like terror or more like leisure? It just seems so hard.
Right. So I think those are answerable questions is the the bottom line, right? Sentience is a very hard thing to really, concretely understand, or you can't really measure the thing itself. And there's all these uncertainties, blah, blah, blah. But like at the end of the day, we do have babies, we do have dogs. They don't know how to talk, but we do a pretty good job keeping them happy, right? And so, I think that's proof of concept that you can use indicators of welfare to make some good decisions, at least about sort of the biggest things, the biggest source of happiness or suffering, whatever. So with respect to questions like, are animals happy when they're grazing? Are animals afraid of predators? I do think that these are questions that are going to have to be answered for each species or each group of animals in its own context. There just is a lot of diversity of life on Earth, and this is part of the project of wild animal welfare science, is learning to listen to everyone else. But the tools we have to ask those kinds of questions are somewhat generalizable, and I divide those into the physical indicators of welfare and the behavioral indicators of welfare. So physical indicators would be things like looking at the condition of the body. You can also look at their external appearance. Do they seem to have injuries or disease? You can look at neurotransmitters or glucocorticoids, commonly called stress hormones in the blood, other hormones, body temperature. So the effects of our mental states are manifested in many ways in our bodies. And by measuring those, we can get some useful information on animals' interior states. And then the final set of physical indicators is genetic indicators. So looking at things like biomarkers of aging can be used as proxies for the cumulative physiological stress that an animal has undergone over their lifetime. We've done some work to validate this, and there's more work that needs to be done. But this is the kind of thing that might be broadly useful across many kinds of animals, right? Because that basic structure of DNA is preserved across all of animal life. And then, of course, there are the behavioral indicators, which are the ones we use for our children and pets and others. So looking at things like vocalizations, activity, are they inactive? What sort of posture are they holding? Are they engaging in activities like play or showing fearful behavior? Then there are these sort of cognition or decision relevant behavioral indicators. So looking at, you can actually set up experimental tests to see which things animals prefer. This has been done for chickens to develop some of the information we use to inform what conditions they prefer in factory farming contexts. You can also do the same with wild animals. As you can imagine, setting up these choice experiments in the wild is tricky, but not always impossible. And so you can set up these forced choice experiments to see which things animals prefer. That can be sort of inform which of these things is better for the animal. You can also use them to assess what mental state is the animal in right now. And for example, you can measure whether they seem to be showing a certain amount of cognitive bias, like pessimism. And the hypothesis is that if the animal makes fewer efforts to look for food in areas where it had previously been trained there might be food, that might demonstrate pessimism, and that might indicate a just overall negative affect. So as you can see, there are a lot of assumptions that underlie a lot of these things, and so no single method is perfect. So our general advice to researchers is, one, there's no silver bullet. You want to use multiple different methods, ideally of different types. So some physical, some behavioral. And then there are also among these methods, some that we have more confidence in than others. And for that reason, it's helpful to design experiments in a way where you have at least one metric that is more evidence that we have higher confidence in, and at least one metric that we have less confidence in. And we can then use those results to start building confidence in those other metrics. So trying to see to what extent do these things correlate with each other. And, it's all fuzzy. It's kind of cloudy and never totally certain. But through this process of iterating and using these measurements in different species, in different contexts, and seeing the relationship between the measurements, we're slowly getting a better and better idea of how to interpret these things.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think part of me is like, has this worry that there are so many assumptions, and like in some species I can really get behind, like cortisol really does probably mean the same thing or a very similar thing in chimps as it does in humans. And then the farther you get on the kind of evolutionary tree of life from humans, I feel more worried and uncertain. But I do just feel pretty good about a process that uses tons of different indicators. I'm sure that takes into account like what we know about different species. Like for insects, there'll probably have to be a different set of benchmarks, but we'll be taking those into account. And by thinking carefully and having a very diverse set of indicators, I can just imagine being like, they're in a situation that seems like it might be harmful to them. They have physiological markers of distress. They've got cortisol. They've got behaviors that seem like distress. And just like the whole picture is one where it gets really hard to imagine that all of those things are true and that animal is not feeling stress. Am I feeling too optimistic about this, or do you feel like that kind of optimism is justified?
I think that optimism is justified because what you were describing is you're optimistic about our ability to at least eventually understand questions about welfare by using metrics like these. The thing that can be a bit discouraging is if you look at the state of the science right now, it's nowhere near where we would like it to be. For example, you appropriately mentioned cortisol, one of these stress hormones, as that's one of the most commonly used indicators of welfare. And we've actually found through the research we've been doing on the usefulness and accuracy of these measures that cortisol and other stress hormones are not nearly as useful as many people think they are. So not worthless, but they seem to correlate most tightly with arousal rather than affect. So you'll have a lot of cortisol in your system if you're terrified and running from a predator. You'll also have a lot of cortisol in your system if you're goofing around and playing with your sibling, or if you are having sex, right? These are like high arousal activities where your body needs, triggers a lot of the same kinds of physiological mechanisms. And so this arousal versus valence framing is something that we use to evaluate metrics, because a lot of the physiological metrics do seem to be more closely related to arousal. And again, it's not that it gives you no information. So a lot of the work we're doing is trying to understand, like, in what contexts would higher cortisol probably mean, higher negative subjective experience versus are you just picking up that the animal's moving around more?
Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating. I am interested. You did say that none of these are perfect, but some do seem better. Can you talk about which seem like your favorite, measures of something affective?
Yeah. I don't know about favorite overall, because the motto is always check your species and your question, and different metrics are useful for different things. Yep. But Andrew Sharrow is a researcher who's been collaborating with us on this, and he gave a great presentation on this in which he categorized these indicators into the panda indicators and the beaver indicators, which is a ecology joke. Pandas are seen by ecologists as totally overrated. Like, there's all this conservation money going to them, but like they don't actually have that big an effect on the ecosystem. And so Andrew Sharrow, at least, said among these panda indicators are the glucocorticoids, which we just mentioned, combined body condition, even play. The 5 domains model is a very common model for like looking at different aspects of the animal's environment or physical needs and trying to combine them, but has its limitations. But you asked about the best measures, and again, I don't think it quite makes sense to say which measures are best, but we can at least say which measures are underrated. Our impression of how useful they can be in the literature so far, these are the beaver metrics, the ones that people give enough credit to, but actually these medium-sized rodents can totally re-engineer an ecosystem. They're called ecosystem engineers for that reason. Eager by Ben Goldfarb is a great book on beavers for those who are curious. So beaver metrics, qualitative behavioral assessments, preference testing, neurotransmitters, DNA methylation, which is another one of the genetic metrics I didn't mention yet, the expression of specific genes, then inflammation and oxidative stress. That's the kind of a set of metrics or physiological indicators that broadly represent how quickly a cell is breaking down, and seems like it could be a fairly good indicator of the sorts of physiological stress that are most likely to correlate with emotional stress.
Super cool. I think my main reaction is oh yeah, I've heard of lots of those. I can imagine stories for why they tell us things about how well an animal is doing overall. And I feel reassured. I feel good about us using some combination of those things to try to figure out which things are good and bad for wild animals.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment there that you recognize a lot of those. If you study biology, you know that these are things. We know how to do some biology. And I should be better at it because it is my full-time job, but I do struggle with talking about the state of wild animal welfare science. There's, so much more that we need to do and so much we don't understand and questions we haven't asked, but there's also all these tools lying around. So much that has already been done. And so a lot of the cutting edge work in wild animal welfare science is just taking things that have been used in other contexts and then asking, do they work in this context, or what assumptions are we making, and do those hold? But yeah, there's a lot to work with, and a lot of people who've been working really hard on these and closely related questions.
Cool. Let's leave that there. Pushing on, we've already touched on this issue briefly, but I wanted to explore this tractability question. So how much progress can we actually make on solving or addressing some of the suffering that happens in wild nature? Because it was a big issue for me, and my sense is that it's still a big issue for other people. And maybe to narrow that down, I think one of the biggest reasons it seems kind of intractable is because it feels like anything you tried to do to help, I don't know, a specific species face less predation or, I don't know, face starvation less, would end up creating kind of unpredictable and potentially actively harmful kind of flow through effects. I guess I've kind of given a rough outline of this, but do you mind giving a more concrete example of this worry?
Yeah, I think it's a super important consideration to keep in mind. And it's one of the reasons why we think it will be helpful to have wild animal welfare science as kind of a new research field, is that there's are types of questions that come up when you ask about the interactions between species and the effect on each of their welfare that don't come up as often, say, if you were to focus solely on the conservation of a single species. So definitely important to consider, can be quite complicated. One example that comes to mind is research that has been showing links between the prevalence of Lyme disease in the American Midwest and Northeast and the local extinction of wolves in those regions. So
wow,
the chain goes something like this. So you have this actually happened a while ago in the 1700s, maybe 1800s for areas of the Midwest. Wolves had been numerous, and then humans hunted them to extinction in those regions. Then in the early 20th century was when leash laws first became common in cities, and there were far fewer just domestic dogs roaming the streets and farms. And that made it possible for coyotes to expand their range from the Great Plains, where they'd been historically, into the Northeast and Midwest. And coyotes are now found throughout the nation. And when the coyotes came along, they were eating things, right? But they were also defending territory against other predators. And so they made life harder for red foxes, which were in the region. Red foxes are like wolves and coyotes, also canines, but they're much smaller. So coyotes always win against red foxes, whereas coyotes always lose against gray wolves. So with fewer red foxes, there ended up being more rodents, because rodents are a huge part of their diet. It's part of coyotes' diet, but coyotes are a bit more flexible. Red foxes, they're doing a lot of pouncing on little things. They look like house cats, kind of the way they do it. And more rodents meant more hosts for deer ticks, which are the ticks that bear Lyme disease, which can be a very painful illness for humans. So what we have there is an example of a cascade of interactions that involves both trophic relationships, so food chain, who's eating who relationships, but also some competitive or behavioral relationships.
Yeah. Okay. I thought you were going to give a simple example, like when, I don't know, there's less predation. Yeah, animals starve more because there are more of them. But that, I feel like, even convinces me more of this problem. I could not possibly have guessed anything like that. And it seems like it could really make a difference to the kinds of interventions you'd want to consider and how good or bad they were likely to be. So it seems like a problem.
Yeah, so there are several strategies for avoiding or accounting for this problem, but I do think it is also useful to note that while there are many examples of these cascading interactions, my sense is that the public thinks of ecosystems as more fragile than they actually are. I think this somewhat reflects the thinking in ecology, although lags behind sort of the cutting edge of academic understanding a little bit. So ecology used to have a model of the ecosystem as an organism where every single part was contributing perfectly to this whole. And if you took out any part, the whole would collapse. The model now is ecosystems are a system of interacting components, some of which are more important than others. The analogy that's often invoked is like a web. Interestingly, people often invoke the web analogy to suggest that ecosystems are fragile and any one piece will cause it to collapse. But I think they're actually more like an actual spider web, where there are some strands where if you pull those out, it will collapse. And there are a lot of strands where if you pull those out, they'll get replaced by another strand. And just to gut check this, I think it's useful to think about how we actually see ecosystems manifesting on the landscape. And that's not as discrete chunks of things that work together in just the right way, but typically in gradients, right? So southern Florida, you're in a subtropical forest with palm trees. At the tip of Maine, you get these almost completely coniferous forests, very dense, very dark, trees that don't drop their leaves in the winter. And you get from one to the other basically by a very gradual shifting as you go with latitude of different mixes of trees. And we're using trees here as just sort of a proxy for the assemblages of species in those ecosystems.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I guess it still seems like, if you're trying to implement an intervention to have predictable effects on like the kind of makeup of the species in that ecosystem and the kinds of things that they're going to predominantly experience or not experience anymore, I'm less worried about collapse and more worried about like, that other strand in the web that might get replaced, that might do the replacing of a strand that maybe gets pulled out because we get rid of the ticks that carry Lyme disease or something. Like maybe that other strand is, I don't know, a type of rodent that carries a different parasite. And that parasite is actually causes much more suffering. And that kind of thing seems like the kind of thing I worry most about. But do you think that also that is less of an issue than people might initially think in a similar way?
Right. So I was just making the case that I think we should not panic about these interactions.
Okay.
And like you said, we're not always on the brink of collapse. That being said, I do think they're important. And I think they're especially important from a wild animal welfare perspective, perhaps even more important than if you're only considering, say, the benefits that ecosystems provide to humans or to certain species of conservation concern. Because if the change in population of one species dramatically alters the change of population in another species, that could have, welfare effects on the community. And we care about the welfare of each of the animals in that community. So one of the ways that wild animal welfare interventions can try to minimize the risk of these problems is by finding problems that can be solved in ways that don't change the population of the target species. So if you have a stable population, then it's less likely that you'll initiate these trophic cascades. So one example of that we're really interested in is developing contraception for wildlife. We've been looking into rats specifically because they are frequently poisoned in cities and in agricultural contexts, and the poison is a anticoagulant that often takes days for the rodent to die by bleeding out. So it would be great if we could reduce this cause of death. Some companies have started developing potential products that could address this. We think they need a little more testing, but the technology is either there or close to there. So anyway, you can also imagine using contraception for, let's say, rodents in a wild context where they're in a bottom-up limited situation, where if you have a rodent population that's limited by the amount of food available to them, then if you give them more food, they're only going to grow to a larger population and then start competing for food again, right? They're stuck in this Malthusian trap. But you could provide them with contraception. And if you got the rates just right, it'd be possible to keep the population the same, but reduce the rate of infant mortality. So basically what we're talking about here is a population on the whole that instead of having lots of babies being born and competing with each other for food and only a few of them making it out, a population that has a lot of churn, a lot of death, per year in it, you could have a population that consists more of healthy adults. And so that's the kind of strategy where trying to fix a problem, in this case, starvation as a painful cause of death, and we're doing it in a way that doesn't modify the total size of the population.
Yeah, that makes sense and is reassuring that we could plausibly do that. Does that mean that we are limited to interventions that kind of keep populations stable, or can we do other things?
Yeah, I definitely think there are other options available to us. Another approach is alternating between two different stable, predictable benchmarks. The idea here is you might have choices to establish or modify a habitat such that the altered version is one that exists elsewhere, and you already know how it works, and you're pretty sure that, if you have this assemblage of trees, you're likely to end up with this assemblage of birds, that kind of thing. So this is interesting because it's operating at a much bigger scale, right? The first approach is more of like, let's make sure we're limited to just this one thing. This other approach is like, well, if we take a big jump from here to here, at least we know where we land is another kind of thing that we generally know how it works.
Yeah, yeah. How confident are you that these two kind of approaches will actually work like that? I guess I have this feeling, but I also am such a non-expert, but I have this feeling that like wild nature could still be so complicated that like, yeah, you plan really smart interventions that like look like one of these, and still you get really unexpected effects and end up with something that looks worse than the original.
Yeah. And that's why I think a really important part of any intervention ideally is to follow it up with monitoring and, if necessary, mitigation, right? So you have a plan, you implement it. Typically, you initially implement it at a small scale and then study that and scale it up gradually. And you try to see if things are going the way you thought they would go. You generally look at animal populations at, rates of different causes of death, those kinds of things. And basically, you try to be on guard for scenarios in which your plan ends up not being accurate or your predictions aren't accurate. And then once that's the case, then you try to take actions to mitigate the effects of that. So if you're running a small pilot study, that might just mean stopping the study. I would say this is also sort of a case for preferring interventions that are more easily reversible. So entirely eliminating a species from a system or introducing a species that was never there before that reproduces rapidly, like those are pretty risky things to do. But doing something like administering contraception, you can just stop putting the drug out there. And it's a drug that we already know, at least for the species we've studied, that it breaks down relatively quickly. If anything, that's sort of a hurdle you need to make sure you're continually administering it. But it is the kind of thing that breaks down and does have a relatively short sort of expiration date on it. And it would only be a matter of months until the effects kind of work through the system. And then it won't necessarily have been the case that you will have done no harm, but you can try to detect it as quickly as possible and then adapt to it if you encounter it.
Just to push back a bit, how confident are you that you'd be able to kind of successfully implement interventions that are that like actually will be reversible and that actually you'll be able to mitigate the consequences? I feel like I can just easily think of so many examples where humans have tried to interfere in nature and it's caused unexpected and problematic consequences for decades. So one coming to mind is introducing rabbits or cane toads in Australia, both of which became invasive and destructive species there, or the use of DDT to control malaria-spreading mosquitoes and agricultural pests, which I think then caused sharp declines in bird populations like bald eagles. Yeah, these examples to me just really give me a strong sense of like interfering can go really, really wrong. And like I don't have the sense that whoever introduced rabbits to Australia had, I don't know, could they have predicted how wrong that would have gone? Could you have? Like if that were you now, was that knowable?
I think a really important difference between whatever they might have predicted then and what we might be able to predict now. There are a couple important differences. One, they often weren't trying to make predictions about wild animal welfare or even ecosystems. Like my understanding is that cane toads were introduced to Australia to eat agricultural pests. And as far as I know, they did that job. As far as I know, not a lot of questions were asked about what other jobs they might take up once they were there. So that's part of it. Is just, I think that we shouldn't over-index on cases where no one tried to avoid negative effects. And then another important consideration is that we've learned from a lot of those experiences, which again is not to say that they are easy to predict or will never happen again. But taking your example of DDT and the terrible consequences it had for populations of birds of prey, I don't think even scientists had widespread understanding of the concept of biomagnification at that point. And that's a really important part of what happened there. So the pesticides washed off the fields, ran into rivers, then fish living in those rivers accumulated those pesticides in their bodies, and then the birds of prey eating those fish accumulated the pesticides from the fish that they were eating. And it wasn't just, you get as much pesticide as the fish you ate that day. It's that if you eat these fish day after day after day, certain kinds of chemicals like DDT will attach to tissues in the body and will not be broken down and will accumulate over time, causing just much more intense toxicity than you would have lower on the food chain. So I don't think biomagnification was understood, or at least not widely written about, before Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring in 1962 on this very issue. And now we have a whole new sort of like category of ways things can go wrong and things, questions we would ask before putting something out there. So I really don't want to give the impression that I think it is easy to, make predictable, controlled, safe interventions in wild systems where there are many species interacting. I don't think it's easy, but I don't see any reason to think that it's impossible. And I think we have been making progress. And I think there's every reason to think that if we continue doing research, both at the theoretical level, how do ecosystems work? What sorts of things are likely to have what sorts of indirect effects? And then also at the practical level, is this intervention a good idea? I really think we're going to come up with plenty of things that would be helpful to plenty of animals.
Nice. We've already covered a few interventions that you think could be robustly good, but I'd be very excited to learn about some more. What is an intervention to improve wild animal welfare that you're excited about that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, well, in talking about the problem of wild animal welfare, I've made a few allusions to the progress that we've made in human poverty and public health over recent decades and centuries. I think there's probably a whole class of interventions that's like, look at what's cost effective in public health and see if we can translate that to wild contexts. So vaccinations look like one area that could be pretty tractable in that respect. There have already been wild animal vaccination programs that have been developed for the purpose of protecting humans or livestock from diseases spread by animals. So Finland, for example, had a program vaccinating foxes and raccoon dogs against rabies using bait. So it's an oral vaccine, something they eat, that I believe is just dropped out of helicopters or airplanes en masse. So yeah, when we think of vaccines, we think of people lining up in an orderly line and, getting one shot at a time. But fortunately, we wouldn't have to do that with wild animals. It looks like there's a way to sort of scatter it across the landscape. And, we would love to do more ecologically informed, intensive follow-up than I think the Finnish government did. But at least we didn't see collapse or any terribly disastrous consequences in that case. So yeah, I think vaccinations, especially against extremely painful diseases like rabies that are caused by viruses or pathogens and not by parasites that might be sentient, that seems like a really tractable direction to head in.
Cool. Yeah, that just seems straightforwardly good. Are there risks or kind of ways that could backfire? Or is that just like clearly worth doing?
Yeah, I think it's still something that has some ways it could backfire. So before we did that at large scales, I would want to, the first thing I'd want to check is how does that affect the overall populations of the animals being vaccinated? Are their populations rising because there's lower mortality rates? And if so, is that having effects on other populations? Or is their death being mostly or entirely compensated by some other cause of death? Are they now like getting hit by cars more often? And the nice thing about working with something like rabies is I'm pretty sure that most causes of death are not nearly as bad as rabies. So swapping those out is fine. But yeah, I would want to see if we're avoiding trophic cascades. And then, of course, there's the concern about like direct effects on non-target species. So other animals besides the ones with rabies might be eating those baits and having health effects. So I would want to double check that that wasn't causing harm at large scales. But it's, it seems like the kind of thing where the problems are relatively predictable and it's relatively short list of things. And given that it has been tried before, we think that there aren't going to be a whole bunch of things that jump out, like not a whole ton of unknowns. So again, the kind of thing that you need to do your homework for, but seems totally possible to do so in the relatively near term.
Cool. Yeah. Do you have any kind of concrete predictions about what the flow-through effects might be if there weren't kind of one-for-one replacement of rabies deaths with other deaths?
Yeah, so let's focus on foxes. They have a diet that consists primarily of small animals, so rodents and also snakes and frogs, things like that. They are omnivorous. They also eat berries and plants. So yeah, the first thing I would wonder is, are we having a larger fox population? Does that mean a smaller, let's say, rodent population? And because these are predators, that means that they eat a lot of animals just to support their own body weight. And because they're eating particularly small animals, that does mean it's like a relatively large population that could be affected here. So if we thought that rodents were typically leading net positive lives, then having fewer of them around might be a bad thing for the animal community on the whole.
Yeah. Oh, God, that's so incredibly thorny. Is that the way that this is kind of most likely to end up being net negative? Or another question is just, what is the most likely way that you think this could end up being net negative?
Yeah, I do think that's my guess for what's most likely is if you change the population size of one species, how does that affect the population size of another species, either through predation or competition or other sorts of interactions? But I will note that there are a couple ways around this, as we discussed before. One, you could use something like contraception to mitigate the effects, right? So that there decrease mortality rate, but also decrease fertility rate that keep a population the same size. Two, you might look into this and decide that the math just works out and this is good on net. I also think there's something to be said for doing interventions that have a clear positive effect and represent the kind of interventions that we would want to do in the long run, but might or might not have a net positive effect right now, or we might be uncertain about it. Because remember, that's the status quo for every other thing anyone ever does in the world is do something good that helps someone, and who knows how it affects wild animals, right?
Totally.
So at least improving the tools we have available to help wild animals and the knowledge we have about what kinds of things have what kinds of effects. I think it's reasonable to take a step forward, even if we think there'll be some casualties in the short term. Again, I think that's reasonable. I wouldn't jump to that conclusion, and I would want to have a sense of what kinds of trade-offs we're making here. And I also think it's something that different value systems might differ on and different communities might differ on. So a longer conversation, but I think something that should be on the table.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what I think is called something like the poor meat eater problem, where like there are a bunch of global health and poverty interventions that I feel pretty great about implementing that end up lifting people out of poverty and extending lifespan in a way that might mean that more communities can consume animal products, and especially can consume animal products produced in factory farms. And that seems really terrible. But I at least put some weight on like a value system that says, do it anyways. Like, keep working on global health and development, and then also figure out how to make sure that the factory farm conditions improve. And like, if we can, factory farms that are built in, I don't know, kind of emerging markets are like less terrible than the ones that have been built historically. Does that feel analogous to you?
That is exactly it. Yeah, I have struggled with the poor meat eater problem myself in the past and come to the same kind of conclusion. And I think it's the same kind of theory of change, that it seems like the right direction to head in. It's probably more important to head in the right direction than it is to do everything in the exact right order or has suffered no trade-offs along the way.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to make sure that I really stand by this. I'm curious, it sounds like you've struggled with this before, and I'm happy to either talk about it with regards to the poor meat eater problem or in the case of rabies and similar things. What makes you feel, I don't know, as however confident you do, that heading in the right direction is more important than not worrying a bunch about the suffering caused in the interim?
Yeah, so I'll start with the poor meat eater problem specifically and then try to make the analogy. So big asterisk here. I don't totally trust my reasoning here because it's obviously very motivated. I would really like to not have to take the position that we have to let more people living in poverty die. But it seems to me like when we're talking about the treatment of animals, that seems like something where the idea of the expanding moral circle is pretty relevant, where historically people have treated animals horribly. Factory farming has kind of been this like technological invention of a new way to treat animals horribly. But overall, it seems like increasing wealth and increasing urbanization pretty reliably results in more compassionate attitudes towards animals. Maybe because it's less of a material like us versus them, or of course we have to eat them or whatever, right? So like being vegan is, the reason it's a discussion at all in the social circles I live in is because it's so freaking easy relative to the scale of the problem, right? It's like when I am at this grocery store that is just overflowing with the abundance of all the food that globalization can create, should I buy chicken or should I buy chickpeas, right? Versus like if you are living in a rural community where chicken is your primary protein source and your corn crop didn't do well enough to feed just the chickens that year, like, are you going to start switching to chickpeas? That might not be possible. Anyway, all that is to say, I in that case, I feel, I don't know, moderately confident about the claim that it's actually necessary to raise incomes before, like, that society at least will be able to prioritize animal welfare. And then does that translate to the fox and rabies example? Not precisely, but I think the loose analogy here is it seems like it would be hard to build up a society that cares about wild animal welfare and devotes resources to it and, you know, writes policy in a way that accounts for wild animal welfare if we don't take any steps in that direction until we like know all the answers. It seems like that's going to be a long process itself, right? The social side of implementing the science. And so I think it makes sense to get those gears churning as soon as we can, give people some opportunities for policies to enact. And then there's also these, you know, interactive effects where the implementing the interventions feeds back into the science because it gives us more of an idea of what kinds of problems do happen when you try to do these things and were we asking the right questions and are there gaps in our understanding. So I think that interactive effect is actually probably the best justification for being willing to take some interventions on, even if we think they might not have robustly net positive consequences in the short term.
Yeah. I was ready to be like, I don't know, it feels like there is an important disanalogy where like in the so-called poor meat eater problem, like prosperity does seem like really instrumentally valuable for people being more compassionate toward animals, which seems less true in the wild animal suffering case. But if you just think of it as like field building this field scientifically and building it as kind of like like a public who's willing and excited about these interventions, just seeing some carried out and then learning from them and then like gathering support for them and then gathering support for the next one after that does seem like probably just the most kind of realistic picture about how this goes forward.
Yeah, and I guess the one subtlety I do consider is that I think this argument is strongest for interventions that are either using technologies that we think we're likely to use for a long time or in many different contexts, or are somehow, you know, informing our understanding of ecological dynamics, you know, the understanding of which will be broadly useful. I think the more that an intervention is kind of a one and done thing, or like the less globally generalizable it is, the less strong this argument is. So for example, you know, ocean fishing, the capture of wild fish, involves a huge number of animals, a huge amount of suffering in the take of those fish. I think that there have been a few efforts, really quite small scale still, but a few efforts to make that more humane, such as by designing ships where you can bring a bunch of fish on board and then electrocute them in a pool of water and kill them close to instantly. Hard to know if that would scale, but that kind of thing, like, I don't know if that's going to feed into other kinds of things. I haven't thought about it super long. Maybe electrocution killing is more relevant in other wild contexts than I have thought, but because it seems like the kind of thing that seems specific to the fishing industry, I don't really know where else you would apply it. I would want to just be more sure that that has a net positive effect.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Is there another intervention that right now you'd be excited to implement?
Yeah. Again, with the caveat, not quite right now, but like right now, I'd be very excited to start evaluating whether this is as good as it seems at first glance.
Yeah.
But one that I'm interested in is fire management in fire-prone areas. And this is a interesting example too, because it seems to align quite well with human interests.
Totally.
So if we think about the American West, for example, that's a landscape where historically, at least probably since the last ice age, there has been regularly lots of wildfires caused by a combination of lightning and a lot caused by humans over the last thousands of years. And those wildfires regularly burned down the amount of fuel that was available in a forest, and they would happen frequently, but not at a large scale. Now we've transitioned to a state where we are not regularly starting fires intentionally, and we're frequently fighting fires. And so the fuel builds up. And then when a wildfire does happen, it can be disastrous and, burn whole swaths of a state and cause destruction to many homes, et cetera. So that's sort of the human interest. And it would be great to have more intentional fire management, prescribed burns more frequently that would burn smaller amounts at a time in a more controlled way. It also looks like this is probably a pretty good way of reducing the amount of wild animal deaths that would occur from wildfires. Because if you're working with a fire that is a prescribed burn, it's burning much more slowly and a much smaller area. And so animals have a much better chance of escaping those flames. So again, because burning alive seems likely to be one of the worst ways to die, it seems likely that replacing that with other forms of death is probably better for wild animals. Approaching fire management in a way that reduces the number of animals that die from fire, it seems like something where it might be able to help animals at a pretty large scale. And one thing I like about this is that it helps large animals, but it's particularly helpful to small animals, which are more numerous and have a harder time getting away from fire. But meadow voles and grasshoppers and snakes, they all stand a chance of getting away from a small fire, but not from a huge raging one.
Yeah. Is there a reason we're not doing this more already?
I'm sure there are a bunch of reasons. I'm sure I don't know them. My rough impression is that wildfire management is just a incredibly, mostly politically complicated thing in terms of who's willing to take those risks. And then also who's willing to invest those resources, kind of like you have with many kinds of disaster preparedness. Investing the resources ahead of time is the best way to prevent it, but is, the harder political pitch to make. So it is very complicated, and all the fire ecologists I know feel quite frustrated at the state of things. So this will take more than just the wild animal advocacy to solve.
Yeah.
I think this is just one more reason to do it. And it might also affect, once we do start doing it, might affect how we do it exactly, like what the guidelines are about how frequently or what size burns or what habitats you prioritize doing them in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel excited about that. One idea that came up in an interview we did with Kevin Esfelt was using CRISPR gene drive technology to eradicate screwworm, which is, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, a parasitic larva that eats animals, especially cattle, from the inside out. And it sounds, truly like horrible torture. Yeah, what do you think about this idea?
Yeah, I'm quite excited by the idea. So a few more details for those who aren't squirming yet. It's a fly that lays its eggs on the open external wounds of mammals, at least mammals, maybe also others. And then the eggs, once they hatch, they immediately burrow into the flesh and eat the necrotic flesh around the wound. So they're called screwworms because they physically have a literal screw-like shape. So they're born and then they just start wriggling and screwing into the flesh, and it can be extremely painful. So, it seems really terrible, and terrible enough that it has caused enough physical damage to livestock to be a problem for the livestock industry. Used to be a problem for humans as well when we had less good sanitation. No one has studied the effects on wild animal welfare that I know of, but I think it's quite likely that many more wild animals are affected by screwworms than livestock by virtue of, this thing we keep bumping into, which is just livestock are really big. It takes a lot of resources to support them, and in any given environment, you're likely to find many more small animals than big animals. So, we're not sure exactly, but this is actually a project that we have been considering taking on in the near term, looking a little bit into the empirical questions of what other species are affected by this, and then modeling how big was the effect of the eradication of the screwworm from North America. It seems like it could be quite promising. Again, we run into the questions of what are the indirect effects on other species, but a pretty good candidate, I think, for a highly cost-effective, large-scale intervention.
Okay, cool. Do you have a take on CRISPR in particular, using, gene drives to actually make them sterile? Does that seem like the right approach, or are you excited about another one?
Yeah, I think that has a lot of potential. To take a step back, the history of this is that New World screwworm used to be prevalent throughout North America. There was a multinational effort to eradicate it, and it has now been functionally eradicated everywhere north of Panama. And that effort did not use gene drives at all. It didn't use any sophisticated genetic technologies. It used radiation to radiate a bunch of male flies and then release them in the wild. And so these were just sort of flies who had been nuked, and they'd just been fried a little bit so that they were sterile. So really,
that's fascinating
stuff, technologically speaking.
Yeah, and maybe terrible for them.
Maybe terrible. Yeah, I don't know the details. I mean, it was something about the frequency of the radiation was sufficient to render the males sterile, but not inactive. Because the crucial part is that they then go out into the environment and unsuccessfully try to mate with a bunch of females and then sort of clog up the breeding pool there.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's possible to do that without gene drives. And so insofar as gene drives are not appealing or become a problem or take a while to develop, we don't have to wait on gene drives to scale up screwworm eradication to extend that to other regions. That being said, I think that gene drives are quite exciting. The hesitation in my voice only comes from the fact that I'm worried about getting too excited about them. In theory, CRISPR and the use of gene drives and daisy chains, which are kind of gene drive that limits the extent of the gene drive, so you can implement a change in the gene pool and then it'll kind of wear out after a few generations. All of this could open up so many ways to help wild animals be immune to diseases or who knows what. And so that's a really exciting door that opens up a lot of science fiction. And I just think we need to be very careful strategically about how we open that door. People have been very resistant to the development of genetic technologies in the past. Genetically engineered foods, for example, there's tons of science showing that they're safe, but because of the reckless and pretty evil actions of Monsanto and other companies when they were first developing these technologies, they got a reputation as something that couldn't be trusted. And so given the potential of gene drives, I just think it's useful as a movement to move as slowly and strategically as possible in terms of developing them technologically, but also from a social and regulatory standpoint, making sure that this remains an option. And so that likely looks like, initial use of gene drives in the wild being focused on something that is clearly beneficial to humans, like the eradication of malaria, and then only moving from there to things that are optimized for wild animal welfare.
Yep. Okay. Yep. I see. I mean, that all sounds reasonable and wise.
Okay, let's talk about other common objections you hear. So one is nature is good. So in other words,
the natural world and kind of natural and wild places are special and important. And even though the circle of life is violent and brutal and might cause some animals to suffer sometimes, it's also special. And we should kind of preserve and protect that specialness. Do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, I think the claim nature is good often has bundled together in it some empirical assumptions and some normative claims. So the empirical assumptions are things we've been talking about the actual facts of the matter. How much are animals suffering in these circumstances? Is that outweighed by other experiences in their life? And then the normative claim, which I think is really what you're trying to get at here, is like, is there some other thing that we should be valuing other than just the experiences of the individuals? Obviously, this is an area where different ethical systems can diverge. If you're more consequentialist, I think this would be less persuasive. Many forms of deontology would be more interested in these kinds of arguments. But I think for all of those systems, you would at least need a way to explain why we're treating animals differently than we treat humans. And normally, nature is good is not a sufficient reason for letting children die of malaria or letting people's homes be burned in wildfire or any number of totally naturally occurring harms that humans have spent centuries insulating ourselves from. And so I think just in practice, most people, even if they hold this belief in some circumstances, are actually applying a double standard, and a more fair and more compassionate, more ethical approach would acknowledge that even if there is some value to naturalness itself, it's probably not worth imposing or allowing for extreme suffering.
Yeah, so just to quickly define those terms, consequentialism is the philosophical orientation that says you should evaluate the morality of actions based on their outcomes, whereas deontology says an action is good or bad based on whether you've kind of followed the right moral rules or duties, kind of regardless of the consequences. But yeah, I can really easily get in touch with this feeling. Like, I imagine watching Planet Earth and Blue Planet, and I can picture the polar bears and the parrots, and I'm like, it is really cool that basically no humans have entered parts of the Amazon and that those things arose naturally and they go about their business and they're so diverse and so magical and so special. And I feel a real pull toward that. But I think the thing that you've said is just true for me. Like, that is a reason. It's just not a good enough reason to accept the kinds of experiences that we think these animals might be having. So maybe there's something about accepting it as a real value, but just being like, it's not a value that trumps other ones. Like, make sure that there aren't trillions of beings having terrible experiences on the regular.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, that it's totally fair for those values to be on the table. My suspicion is that lots of times people are just not giving enough weight to these other values, which are the experiences of the wild animals themselves. And I also think there's some interesting things to dig into on that point about the value of totally undisturbed nature. I also really treasure that. Some things to pull apart there. One, there's a value there, which is me enjoying that. That is a real welfare thing. Put that on the scales. But the animals living there might feel differently. Like, I find it very interesting to go into extremely poor neighborhoods in other countries and see what that world is like. But I have some sense that, like, these are slums, and I shouldn't just, like, celebrate these unabashedly. Like, there are trade-offs here. It's interesting for me, but I would prefer people not live in slums. And then there's the idea of undisturbed nature itself, which is just historically inaccurate for most places on Earth, unless you want to, like, really wind back the clock tens of thousands of years, which you might, but it just is the case that many of the animals and environments that we know today have lived in the presence of humans for a long, long time. So humans, as they spread across the earth, when they migrated out of Africa for the first permanent time, they did cause a lot of extinctions of megafauna, large animals that used to live on other continents. The reason that Africa still has so much megafauna is in large part because elephants and Cape buffalo and zebras and giraffes evolved in the presence of humans and learned to be afraid of naked little monkeys. So like, there's a human part to elephants. There's a knowledge of humans in their instincts. So that's an old example. The newer example is in North America. When the European colonists first came to Massachusetts, they were amazed at these park-like woodlands where you could just ride your horse through them. They're filled with sunlight because there's almost no underbrush. It was just big trees, lots of sunlight, strawberries growing on the ground. That's because the American Indians of the region were actively managing that land and prescribing burns every few years to keep the forests open, to maximize the amount of rabbit and deer and turkey that could live on the land, to maximize their own ability to hunt those animals. So something like that had probably been going on since the retreat of the glaciers about 10,000 years ago. So there's just no version of, in this case, Northeast woodland American nature that didn't have humans in it. So I also like getting away from humans, but I think this idea of nature as a sort of like default without humans, I think that's just not the case in many places.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I basically feel at least, very pulled in that direction, sympathetic. I guess it seems like there's a difference between humans kind of doing our human things, which has some consequences for non-human animals in the wild, and then very deliberately, trying to meddle with the experiences of wild animals in potentially quite kind of extreme, deliberate, calculated ways. And I guess some feelings I have about that are like, one, who are we to say what's best for animals? Like, it seems like I barely know what's going on for my dog when she like looks at me, let alone what's going on for a frog when she climbs up a tree with the babies on her back.
Yeah, I think that question is the answer. Who are we to say what's best for animals? I don't think we should be making up answers willy-nilly. I think we should be trying really, really hard to ask animals and understand their answers. And that means doing a lot more research than we've done, means developing new ways of asking these questions, that is, of understanding animals' preferences and what things cause them stress or joy. So that is the whole project of wild animal welfare science. The goal is not to just arbitrarily meddle in nature, but the goal is to, as much as possible, try to figure out in an evidence-based way, if animals could ask things of us, what would they ask for? And then try to act on our best guesses as the answers to those questions. Like you say, that's the kind of thing that we choose to do for our dogs and for our children before they learn to speak. We have some experience in caring for sentient beings who can't speak to us directly, but have other ways of expressing their emotions, and we have other ways of interpreting those. I think it's just a matter of expanding that out to more and more species.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting an image of if I, were to be near really any wild animal, and that wild animal were a regular part of my life. I mean, I think I'd basically like get a sense of them as a person and very much want to try to make sure that they had a better life than a worse one, in the same way I do for my dog. Like, if I just picture like the deer in the meadow outside our house, I'm like, I would care about them too. And we're probably doing some very dehumanizing / depersonizing mental gymnastics when we're like, like we shouldn't bother meddling, when we're like, I would like to meddle in my dog and cat's lives to make sure that they're regularly fed and warm.
Exactly.
So we had Peter Godfrey Smith on the podcast recently, and he spends a kind of significant amount of time near and around wild animals in wild nature. And his perspective is that in the same way that humans don't tend to think of all of their negative experiences as terrible or purely bad, we tend to think of our experiences as kind of maybe bad in the moment, but like contributing to this like rich life history that we then interpret and kind of reframe, but potentially in like a very real way as like, yeah, like what life is about. And like the negative experiences contribute often in different ways, but as much as the positive ones do. And just in general, like he sees, you know, birds making nests and having their eggs hatch. And he feels like people who are worried about wild animal suffering might be totally ignoring kind of the richness and just all the triumphs that wild animals are having because they have a mix of good and bad experiences. And I think it's fair that I wouldn't necessarily eliminate all of my negative experiences if I could snap my fingers.
I listened to that episode and I might have missed something about his argument, but as far as I could understand it, it seemed like he was asking for more wild animal welfare science. It seemed like he was doing the thing that I'm saying we should do, which is ask these questions about.
It's true that was his, I think, bottom line.
Yeah, it sounded to me like a hypothesis about, you know, empirical facts, like what might actually be the balance of things that are valuable to a certain kind of parrot in this case. And one of the reasons that we at Wild Animal Initiative take this approach of trying to support the growth of a academic field, like a research community, rather than just having a few groups figuring stuff out, is like we want there to be the institutional and intellectual infrastructure to continue to bring in people with different perspectives who can challenge whatever the existing dogma is, because understanding other minds is really difficult and I think will be a long-term project. And I think he's right that lots of the characterizations or sort of hypotheses that have been put out there so far do make relatively simplistic guesses about the balance of negative and positive experiences, especially over time. But I think, I just think that's another question that we could be asking and we could be getting at least rough answers to, or making our best guesses. Again, all toward the goal of making our best guess as to what the animals want for themselves, and to simply say those questions are too complicated, let's maintain the status quo, or let's wind the clock back to 1492, or whatever it is you're doing. I just think that is making, you know, all the assumptions you could possibly make about what's good for wild animals. I think that involves almost no asking them. And I'm just really curious about questions like that. Do moments of triumph outweigh many moments of struggling for these parrots? I don't know. I would like to know.
Yeah. It's funny to me because clearly it's an open question in like human philosophy and philosophy of the good life. And it seems like he would, in fact, be open to just like, yeah, wild animals deserve us philosophizing about what makes for a good life for them too. What about something along the lines of, if you take wild animal welfare seriously, you might end up concluding that you need to do something really extreme and potentially, for some people, morally kind of unjustifiable in its own right, like kill all big predators or something, or like keep all big predators apart from, I don't know, their prey animals, which for some people I think would be a very obviously bad outcome. And that kind of leading to very bad outcomes should make us suspicious of the whole endeavor. I guess another example of this is like, if you like maybe one could conclude that there is so much wild animal suffering in nature that just having way less wild animals alive would be the best solution. And yeah, part of me has a strong gut reaction that is like, if the solution here is finding ways to kind of eliminate wild nature by creating other kinds of places that are less wild and less hospitable to wild animals, then I feel suspicious of that as as like a goal, and then as a field that has that goal. Yeah. How do you orient to this kind of argument?
First, just for background, there might be some listeners for whom the idea of killing all predators or destroying habitat might just be a totally new idea. To your credit, you did not make up those crazy ideas on the spot. These are things that have been discussed a lot, particularly by the philosophers who've written about this idea and who I think really deserve credit for drawing a lot of attention to it. But a big part of the reason that Wild Animal Initiative focuses on the natural science side of things is that we think that the lack of empirical understanding of wild systems and what we might be able to do to support wild animals is actually limiting our ability to imagine what solutions might look like. So yeah, I think we just need to push ourselves to be more imaginative as to how you might solve problems without just eradicating the entire populace who's suffering from the problem, right? Like that is not on the table for human poverty at all, for good reason, I think. So I think that would be my first response, is that just because you could take it to places that seem extreme doesn't mean that necessarily is the direction it's going.
Yeah, that makes sense. Was there another reason there?
Yeah, another thing that I think is really important to think about is the ways that entertaining these extreme ideas affects the pursuit of the project itself. So part of this is epistemic and part of it is movement building. The epistemic argument is laid out really well in a paper by Tyler John and Jeff Sebo in 2019, Consequentialism and Non-Human Animals. And they call this the logic of the logger, this idea that like the best thing we can do is just destroy nature. And they say, even if that ends up being true, given what we know about how people deal with cognitive dissonance, it's hard to imagine building a society that really takes wild animal welfare seriously while the whole time committing to just destroying them. Again, not that it's impossible, but it just seems like a really hard pathway to get there. So we should be quite resistant to approaches to wild animal welfare that are more likely to cause us to disregard wild animals in the pursuit of it. And then the final consideration I'll speak to here is what I'm calling the movement building consideration, which is that, again, even if it ends up being the case that the only way or the best way we can improve wild animal welfare is with measures that are so extreme that they seem to obviously violate our values, judged from our current perspective, we still just cannot get to that point practically, empirically. Like there's just no way you could know that without enlisting the help of conservation biologists and ecologists and animal behavior scientists, like a huge set of people who are currently deeply committed to protecting wild animals and preserving habitat. And so given that this topic is basically a non-starter for the experts you need to test that hypothesis, I think we should be really reluctant to bring it up too much or to emphasize it. And again, I'm not proposing a Trojan horse here. I'm just saying this is just not the interesting thing to talk about in the next few years or decades.
Okay. If in 3 to 5 decades we've been able to learn with confidence that there is enormous amounts of suffering in the wild and none of the interventions that we've been able to identify and test will kind of reliably address all of that suffering. At that point, would you be advocating for somehow, kind of unwilding places, I guess? The classic image I have for this is paving over the Amazon and putting up a parking lot.
thank you for being so generous with letting me skip around the thought experiment and talk about practical considerations. But if I'm going to really engage with this as a thought experiment, and I'm going to accept the premises that we've gotten to this place and we're confident in this conclusion, then at least within my value system, yes, that is a choice I would want to make, because I don't value things other than individuals' happiness or suffering so much so that I would allow for the continuation of large amounts of suffering just for the preservation of beauty or naturalness or diversity. Now, someone might, that might be your value set, but if it is, I would say you have a pretty cruel set of beliefs. And I'm guessing that you might not apply those in other areas. And I'll note that in the context of factory farming, for example, it's a little easier there because we're not dealing with a natural system, but many people advocate for veganism or other ways to lead to the abolition of factory farming. And the basic premise there is that it would be better for these animals if they were never brought into such a torturous existence. So this is not an idea that is totally novel. This is a choice some people have made for other sets of animals. It's a choice people often make for their pets at the end of their pets' lives. It's a choice that many individual humans make for themselves at the end of their lives, where they decide the suffering is going to outweigh the happiness and they want to die sooner. And so if we're really in the scenario that you pose with a thought experiment, then in that scenario, the animals are effectively wanting to not have to undergo all this suffering that happens when they're brought into existence. And so in this scenario, the compassionate thing to do would be to put our reluctance aside and meet their needs by preventing them from coming into existence. And you might have values other than compassion, but at least that's where the compassion values would point to.
I find that really, really compelling. I do think I put you in a tough spot by asking you to answer about a thought experiment that is quite extreme, but I think that's probably just the most humane possible answer you could give.
I will say that while that thought experiment presents the most extreme form, I can imagine in the relative near term coming upon what you might call like reduced versions of that thought experiment. So when I said earlier that, one wild animal welfare intervention might be to preferentially plant some kinds of forests instead of others, that's essentially making a decision about what kinds of lives you're trying to bring into existence through your forest management policy. And this is something, again, that humans are already having a huge effect on without trying to consider wild animal welfare. But one of the things that does make wild animal welfare so tricky is that there very often are real trade-offs between different species, and between even just the juveniles and the adults of the same species. So I think it's reasonable that we would have to consider this idea of whether animals are living negative lives and what sorts of actions we might take to do that. I just don't think we're anywhere close to having to consider the most extreme end of that spectrum.
That feels extremely compelling to me. And I'm already finding myself being like, yeah, I guess that is one side of a spectrum. And somewhere on that spectrum is something like choose an ecosystem that has significantly less wildlife than another one, because we know that the species that are like really natural to that area happen to suffer from parasites with horribly, I don't know, disfiguring or painful or something symptoms. So yeah, I think you've just basically got me pretty convinced and sold. Are there any other objections that you hear regularly that we should cover before we move on?
One objection I hear from other animal advocates in particular is not so much an objection based on principle and more a sort of movement strategy question of like, how can we possibly undertake this huge, complicated, thorny set of issues when there are things right in front of us that we know how to solve? Like, we could really possibly end factory farming within our lifetimes. And so shouldn't we just solve the problems that we caused first? And I don't know the total answer to that, but I think important parts of the answer, at least, are I don't think it matters to the animals whether we caused the problem or not. I think what matters to them is what their experiences are and can they have a better life. So I think we need to focus on the animal experience. Two, I do think it is the case that for problems that humans are actively causing, it's often easier to change or prevent those than problems that are existing in nature. So there is a real cost effectiveness argument that I think should be considered there. But then finally, I think that the idea that you can pursue problems sequentially just is inaccurate, that actually the practice of and doing factory farming will have huge impacts on wild animals. So one of the main reasons that you would want to have a society that eats way less meat or no meat at all is that it's an extremely energy inefficient way to produce food. If you're higher up on the food chain, you need more total land to support yourself. And so huge swaths of the world are dedicated to the production of feed crops, which are then fed to animals, which are then fed to humans. So there's an environmental argument that not producing so much meat would mean that we wouldn't have to waste so much land on feed crops. But then there's a question of what would become of that land if it's not being used for feed crop production. And there's a pivot point that's introduced there where in theory, I suppose you could wait until you solved all the other problems and then get to this problem. But in solving the other problems, you might have accidentally made this problem way worse. And you might have lost an opportunity to set up ecosystems that are more likely to have more animal flourishing as those ecosystems are changing anyway due to human action. So that's why I think I don't know exactly what the right distribution of effort and resources is, but I do think we need to do at least enough of our homework on wild animal welfare that will be prepared for this real hinge moment of land management post-factory farming.
Yeah, that I hadn't considered that at all, and I find that really persuasive. Yeah, is there more to say on the way factory farming as a problem area interacts with wild animal welfare?
I think the other main interaction I see is just that I also wouldn't advocate for focusing purely on wild animal welfare just because the problem is so huge. I think that we need to think strategically about not just sort of the in the field practicalities, but also the social movement aspects. And it's hard for me to imagine a society that really takes wild animal welfare seriously and devotes huge amounts of resources to improving the welfare of wild animals while simultaneously tolerating the torture of so many animals in factory farms. So I think that the ending of factory farming is probably a necessary part of taking society in a direction where people take animals' interests more seriously and act on that understanding.
Yep, makes sense. I'm glad we talked about that because I had originally written a question asking about, is this just not our problem because we didn't cause it? And then I personally find that just so uncompelling. Like, we didn't make malaria, but obviously we still want to solve it. But yeah, that seems really important. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up. Are there any interventions that, we won't be able to implement anytime soon, but that you've kind of heard brainstormed that you can imagine getting really excited about in the future when we learn them more? I don't know, maybe something like new science being developed or new technologies that could really change the tools you have.
Right. I'm really glad you asked about things that aren't possible yet, because I am quite confident that the vast majority of the things we will do that will benefit wild animals are things that we can't quite imagine right now. I think we're just so early days in our understanding of the science and our development of the technology. I think it's something akin to like someone in medieval Europe understanding the problems of speciesism, and then not only might they might struggle to conceive of veganism, right? Because
totally
much of that terrain is just so limiting in terms of what you can possibly grow that could support humans. But they definitely couldn't imagine plant-based meat and definitely not cultivated meat, right? But these might end up being huge parts of the solution to animal farming. So I try to remind myself that I'm not entitled to all the answers here, that I might not be able to imagine them, and that's mostly a good thing. I think there are almost certainly more possibilities than we can imagine. That being said, there are a couple things I use to sort of hold that space in my imagination, and gene drives is one of them, as you mentioned, because these are things where, in theory, it seems like we could precisely alter the genes of wild animals and then have those spread through populations. And there's all sorts of things that might be possible through there. The ones I can imagine right now are mostly related to disease resistance or perhaps ability to tolerate other potentially painful experiences or knowledge to avoid them or who knows what. So that's, one door to many futures. And then another thing I think about is not at all a suggestion for a direction to look for cost-effective, scalable interventions, but just a reminder of how weird nature is. There's a story I really love that came to me through Robert Sapolsky, who's a primatologist, and he and some other researchers followed this one troop of baboons, and this troop came into contact with another troop of baboons. This other troop, unlike the baboons that had been living out in the savannah in sort of ancestrally representative ways, these baboons were just squatting on a garbage dump that I believe was near a tourist lodge or something. They're just sitting there and they just had all the food they could ever want. It was just, the best, right? So cool. And so the invading troop correctly assessed this to be the way to live and a great source of food. And so, as baboons do, they went to war. Baboons are a social species like humans. They're a much more patriarchal and sexually dimorphic species in which the males have like huge canines they use for intimidation and fighting. And so there's this very clear class division where all the adult males went to fight the other troop. And I believe they did successfully drive them out of the trash dump. The problem was, it turned out that the baboons at the trash dump had a disease, I think it was canine distemper. And so shortly after the invading troop got access to this bounty of food, their males all fell ill and died because they had been swapping fluids with these infected males of this other troop, and they all got canine distemper and died. And so what was left was a troop of baboons that was only mothers and other adult females and children. And so the next generation of baboon boys grew up to be matriarchal and caring, and they would groom each other and help take care of the babies. They would do all the kinds of things that their mothers did because they only had mothers. They didn't establish the same aggressive, violently constructed social hierarchy that we had previously assumed to be a figment of baboon physiology and genetics and instinct. All the baboon troops we'd ever seen had been incredibly violent and patriarchal. Turns out there are conditions on which baboons will not act that way. I believe the troop didn't stay that way forever. You can imagine all you need is one big bully to come in for bullying to become the effective strategy again.
Or like hormones and puberty.
Yeah, my understanding is that hormones in puberty were enough to make the fatherless boys grow up into baboons who acted somewhat different from the females, but just not as different as we thought they would, and not different enough to upset the balance on their own.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. So social animals, they're like animals that have really complex social groups like that are, they're not extremely rare, but they're definitely not among the most numerous animals on Earth. And so I don't think of this as like the kind of thing that we should really be trying to fiddle with and scale. But I hold it in my head as like, there just could be so many other arrangements, these alternate stable states, socially or ecologically or, in all sorts of different ways that could be possible. And the configurations of nature are not limited to what exists right now.
Yeah, that feels like a great segue to the next kind of category of things I'm interested in, which is just what is the long game for wild animal welfare? Even if we find some kind of robustly good interventions, would that actually solve wild animal suffering? What does success look like to you? Is it more like eradicating poverty, or more like changing the physiology and sociology of wild animals much more radically, or something else?
Yeah, I don't know what the longest game looks like. And I think that's a really important part of wild animal welfare research and advocacy, is standing with that uncertainty and not trying to jump to conclusions or get stuck on any one vision of something that we just don't have the tools to envision yet. And I think it's also useful to point out that I don't know many people who have an end game for human policy, right? Who can really imagine a world with zero human suffering. Like, there are some ideas out there, and there's definitely been more science fiction and utopian political science done for humans than there has been for Atlantic cod. But I think it's I just want to make sure we're not holding this movement to too high a standard. That being said, some things I can imagine, some steps along the way. First step is get wild animal welfare science to the point where conservation biology is today. So that would be, a large body of literature in which we understand a lot of the things that we're studying and have a narrowed set of the next questions to ask. Also, academic institutions that exist to continuously support and fund and house that kind of research, and governments at all levels, really, from local to multilateral, having conservation bodies and recognizing conservation as one of the goals that they're trying to pursue, in addition to the many other priorities we have when we're governing human welfare. So that's kind of one milestone. And that's what Wild Animal Initiative as an organization is optimized to achieve. Beyond that, or other parts of the vision for the future, I think, could be imagining social and political systems where wild animals have more representation. So I don't know, I can't imagine ever living in a democracy. I think we'll always live in an autocracy ruled by a single species, that is humans. Even if all humans get represented perfectly, right? That's still 0.01% of sentient animals at most. But I can imagine systems where there are regulations that require people, say, when building new buildings, to consider the impacts on wild animals, or systems that, ideally would give wild animals some form of representation. And there has been some nice utopian legal scholarship on this topic, but there's also been some real concrete efforts. There's a great book called Meet the Neighbors by Brandon Keim. It just came out earlier this year, and highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in animal ethics and wild animal welfare. He kind of starts from the beginning, what do we know about sentience, and zooms all the way out to what should we do about tadpoles in puddles.
Cool.
And one of the stories he covers is about these cormorants, a kind of waterbird living on this a patch of conservation land, I believe is an island in Toronto, and they were pooping on all the trees. They have this habit of nesting in big colonies in great densities. And this is something that they often do in nature, is they will nest in such great densities that they destroy the plant life, which is often okay. But in the case of Toronto, which had so few green spaces, and the Leslie Street Spit, which was this space, was treasured by so many people, they really didn't want to give up their one green space. And so the original plan was to eradicate all the cormorants. But then local animal activists took action, and they advocated for the cormorants, and they ended up sort of setting up this ad hoc decision-making process where they had, I believe it was a sort of commission that was deciding how to solve this problem, and there was a person on that commission that was representing the cormorants' interests. So there's a cormorant person, and there's also, an urban planner and a wildlife management official, right? And the solution they ended up coming to was one that did not require any killing of cormorants, involved moving their nests to certain places when they were away for the winter, and basically discouraging the occupation of one side of the island and encouraging them to occupy the other side of the island. So I just think it's so cool where we're so far from a political system that entirely encapsulates wild animal interests, but I think things like this would be part of the step toward it. And again, I'm most interested in the science right now because I think that's what's most rate limiting, but I think the social and political systems will be another big part of the long game. And that's maybe the edge of where I can imagine. Because at least once we have that set up, once we have a way of knowing what the right thing to do is, and then ways of putting that into action, those are at least the ingredients you need to continually improve wild animal welfare at larger and larger scales.
Okay, yeah. One out there possibility that is kind of on the science side that hasn't come up much is somehow eliminating the kind of biological basis for suffering, or at least some kinds of suffering, like how bad it feels to be really hot or how bad it feels to be really hungry. Does that seem plausible to you? I'm trying to think of concrete examples that seem good to me, but as soon as I do, it seems like I'm like, oh, but then they'd die because they'd stop being really motivated to eat or something, or like avoid extreme heat. Is there some version of this that seems plausible to you? Maybe like a stewarded case where we're helping meet animals' needs. And so it's less important for them to have lots of physical pain to motivate them to do things.
This does exist in humans. There's a disorder, I don't know what it's called, but there are some humans who can't feel physical pain, and very few of them end up living very long, because even if you have a full human brain, or at least a child or teenager brain that is oriented toward trying to be aware of risks, so many people are still either tempted to take risks or tolerate things that others wouldn't tolerate, and end up at least regularly suffering bodily harm, and sadly often dying before adulthood. So this is what we observe in the humans who have this condition. We can imagine a more deliberate version of that. I do think there is this general issue, as you point out, that pain seems to be related to motivation to avoid things that are going to be bad for the animal's survival, at least. Which is not always the same thing as bad for their welfare, but often pretty closely correlated. It seems theoretically possible to have a rational actor who recognizes noxious stimuli and avoids them without having a direct experience of them, right? Like if you're designing a artificial intelligence to do this, you could have them code pain and happiness as red and blue, not as ouch and yay, but it just does seem to be the case that everything is feeling pain right now. That is a big part of their motivation. So yeah, technically I have no idea how feasible it is. Ecologically and behaviorally, I would worry about the effects of that. Maybe the version that is most imaginable to me is if you had this sort of reaction triggered only in very specific circumstances. So, we were talking before about how many animals get swallowed whole and digested by stomach acids. Maybe you have a reaction where if the chemicals that are present in owl stomach acids touch your skin, then your pain response turns off or something. And that would probably not make a difference for many mice, and might save many mice from a couple minutes of chemically burning alive. So yeah, there might be versions of that are possible.
Yeah, that's making me realize that the only cases I've actually heard even weakly proposed are in the case of factory farming. You might try to eliminate the biological basis of suffering for parts of the factory farming process that are hard to get rid of, like slaughter or some particular kind of rearing of animals that's like important to how we then raise them for food. And whether or not that seems like a good idea, maybe we don't have to solve that now. But I'm realizing that that's because they're going to die. We can do that because they don't need to avoid terrible things. In fact, they can't avoid the terrible things. They're going to be fattened up according to the system anyways. But this seems much, much, much trickier in any cases where wild animals have to go out and live their lives. Are there any kind of futures for wild animal welfare that we haven't talked about yet? Or does that feel as close to the vision that you'd want to describe?
I guess one other category of visions I have, or flavor maybe, is imagining that there could be landscapes that are very different from the ones that exist now, or there's this idea of novel ecosystems as becoming of particular interest as climate change sort of shifts around the parameters that certain landscapes are existing under right now. And then also there's the spread of different species facilitated by humans, of invasive species around the globe. So we're already starting to get these novel ecosystems that are happening accidentally. It seems plausible that there could be sets of animals and plants that could just have higher welfare on net than the ones that exist now. So, particularly if we were to think that most animals in a forest had net positive welfare, for example, like what if there were forests with trees and plants that just tended to have much more nuts and berries, and food was easier to find for everyone. And there are a bunch of ways that there could be unintended effects on insect populations, and who knows, but right, it's like you just could imagine there could be something that feels more like an orchard to the animals living in it than the forest they live in now.
Yeah.
Or on the other side, if you think if it turns out that there are many kinds of animals that don't have net positive lives, maybe there are certain kinds of quieter landscapes that would facilitate more happiness or less suffering. So things that look more like the rocky alpine meadows, which people often choose as their representative nature when they put a photo of something on their computer desktop, or, stretches of desert, or, just to see how wacky I can get things. I have no idea what the welfare implementation and consequences of this would be, but sometimes I imagine what if you had a desert with a bunch of pools in it, and all the pools had coral reefs in it, and then also there were bison roaming around. What? That might be physically possible. And then,
and
would that be good for this fish and bison? I don't know. Yeah, no, this is actually, you're right, oddly, suspiciously correlated with the animals and landscapes I enjoy watching. But who knows?
Yep. I just feel very compelled by the idea that there must be some variation in landscapes and welfare. Surely they're not all equal. And so figuring out what the highest welfare landscapes are, and then figuring out what makes them high welfare, and just optimizing for that doesn't seem insane. And that feels really cool and hopeful to me.
Yeah. And again, this tracks what humans have been doing for ourselves, right? As we've pursued different ways of designing villages and then cities, as we found different forms of farming, we've been gradually building landscapes that just meet our needs more. So you could imagine incorporating others' needs into those calculations as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that you say that, it really does feel like a lot of the objections I hear to specific wild animal welfare ideas apply to humans and have been at least semi-resolved in the case of humans. I don't know, when I'm worried about increasing population numbers because we're eliminating diseases in wild animals, I'm yeah, that's exactly what we did for humans. And then we also found a way to support more humans. And now we've got a massive population that we're increasingly able to support and take care of. And maybe we can just do that. Maybe we don't have to have this I feel like we have a very short-sighted,
I think short-sightedness is exactly what I would call the biggest problem with assumptions underlying objections to researching and trying to improve wild animal welfare. It's so many of the arguments are some form of, but I can't do this today or tomorrow. And I don't know, maybe there are moral systems out there where you only care about the things you can do today or tomorrow, and benefits to yourself in future years or your grandchildren or their grandchildren don't matter. But I think most of us do care about the things that will happen later. I think we're glad for the things that happen before us that benefit us. So yeah, I just mention wacky things like deserts filled with coral reefs, not because I think they're good ideas, but just because I need some sort of scaffolding to keep my imagination stretched and remember that there are things we haven't imagined yet, and we just want to head in the right direction. All that being said, I do think there is an important disanalogy to human development, which is that when we've made progress for humans, we've measured it purely in terms of progress for humans. So, for example, we're not even accounting for the harms that has caused for factory farmed animals, right?
Totally.
If you do account for them, then suffering has almost certainly increased among the set of humans plus farmed animals, and by huge orders of magnitudes. Now, I think you could probably do away with factory farming pretty easily, and then you could balance the equation, and it would be a good story. But even so, we have not been accounting for the effects on other species. And the fact is that, like humans, all species currently rely on a whole bunch of other species to exist. And so I'm not sure it ever will be possible to have only a few species on Earth who do matter.
Right.
And as long as there are multiple species who matter, there are almost certainly going to be conflicting interests.
Tensions. Yeah. That's such a good point.
And so this is why it might not be possible to have zero suffering, and why it is probably a lot harder to have a steady increase in well-being the way we have had for humans. But again, I don't think it's a reason why any improvement at all is necessarily impossible.
Yeah, that is such a good point. Okay, let's move on and talk about the work Wild Animal Initiative is doing. My impression is that Wild Animal Initiative's central aim is to help build the research field of wild animal welfare. Yeah, can you say something about how exactly you're doing this?
Right. So by field building, we mean supporting the growth of a research community that will be asking the right kinds of questions and continually critiquing itself and sustaining itself. And the sort of thing that can support research on a much larger scale than any one group could ever do on its own. So to seed that, we have three main approaches right now. One is we do our own research to answer questions in wild animal welfare directly, or to exemplify what wild animal welfare science can look like, or to provide or refine tools for other researchers to use. So that's our research department. We also have an outreach program where we present on that research at conferences. We look for opportunities to do research collaborations with others. We provide career services targeted at early stage researchers, so networking events and workshops on how to design studies that account for wild animal welfare. In particular, we've led a series of workshops at conferences that are about how to add welfare considerations onto your existing research, and what kinds of metrics to use or indicators to use for welfare. This is something that often constrains people, as they might be a specialist in animal behavior, but not know anything about how to do genetic analyses. And so another thing we try to do through our research program is directly connect people to collaborate on projects, that connect a animal behavior scientist with a geneticist, so that they can carry out a project together. And then finally, we have our grants program, through which we directly fund projects that researchers are carrying out at universities. So that's just a really great way to directly, concretely plant a bunch of seeds in a bunch of different places and help them grow, give people funding for projects that often wouldn't get funding otherwise, or wouldn't be funded for their welfare component, or those researchers might feel pressured to not talk about welfare in their research. This is something we hear a lot. And so we're encountering all these people who care about animals. That's why they're studying conservation, or that's why they got into veterinary science or whatever. But they feel like they have to translate everything back into its importance to climate change or biodiversity. And so when they get funding from us, they know they get to just talk about what makes the mink happy. And, that's partly about making that research happen. And also, as you can imagine, that feeds back into all of our other efforts. By funding more people, we're growing the community, making it easier for early career researchers to succeed and move forward. And slowly trying to get this field, help it grow. I also think it's important to note, and I sometimes am sloppy with my words, definitely want to avoid any implication that we are the only ones who built this field or that there was nothing before, right? Tons of people were doing tons of relevant research, and we did not come up with this idea, but we are the only organization that is specifically dedicated to trying to help this research come together in a field-like way and trying to help that field grow as much as we can possibly make it.
Yeah. Is there a thing that the Wild Animal Initiative has contributed to that you feel particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think we've got a paper under review now that hopefully will be published by the time the podcast comes out about measuring indicators of wild animal welfare. And this was something where we started out thinking it would be a relatively simple project, and then 85 pages and 30 metrics later, it's like more of a small encyclopedia than a short paper. But the idea is that we've reviewed the literature on all of the common or, currently existing indicators of welfare. And we've ranked these 30 indicators along 11 different criteria to get a sense of, how much do we know about the validity of these, the accuracy, the repeatability, how many species they apply to, what kinds of things does this tell you about the welfare, what kinds of context can you use this? And so this paper's, the research behind it is also research that we've been building on to give workshops on the same topic of what kinds of methods can you use to actually approximate welfare in your studies. And I'm just really proud of that. I think it's going to be a really important thing for the field. And what we've done here is, I think, pretty exemplary of what field building can look like. Is it's not like we've had a ton of scientists working in a ton of labs and inventing a whole bunch of new things that were never discovered before. It's like we had a few scientists working at their computers and reading a whole bunch of papers and just taking the knowledge that already exists and putting it into one place so that you can easily build on that knowledge and say, okay, this is what is known. Or okay, there are a bunch of papers using cortisol as an indicator, but is it really reliable? Who was asked that question and what did they find out? So I hope it will be the basis for much, much more work on research into measures of wild animal welfare. But it's something that I'm very proud of so far that a lot of people have contributed to on Wild Animal Initiative, and we also have external collaborators as well.
Yeah, that's so good. It really did feel to me like, as I learned more about this topic, one of the places I got most hung up was blah, but how could we possibly know if the things that would be bad for me are bad? And what is the day-to-day life and how much is positive and how much is negative? And this just feels like it's going to accelerate so much work and thinking on that. So that is incredibly cool. Okay. How's the funding landscape for wild animal welfare as a problem area? I feel like I know something about Good Ventures, funded by kind of Dustin Moskowitz and his wealth. Something about them requiring open philanthropy to exit the wild animal welfare space. Am I remembering that right? And has that left a big hole for you from a fundraising perspective?
Yeah. So, to their credit, Open Philanthropy was far and away the biggest funder of wild animal welfare over the last few years. They started funding some projects. I believe the first one was around 2019, first funding a couple of researchers. And then in 2021, they funded the first instantiation of our grants program that I mentioned. So they've been making a lot of stuff possible on the order of a couple $1 million a year. So they've definitely left a legacy there. And it's the folks on the farmed animal welfare team that we have to thank for really pushing to include this new direction. Unfortunately, Good Ventures, which is the foundation that Open Philanthropy advises, Good Ventures made the call that they wanted to narrow their focus in several ways. And so there are several of these sort of smaller, likely highly impactful cause areas that they cut back on. And unfortunately, wild animal welfare was one of them. Fortunately, the Navigation Fund, which is a new foundation that has really only started up this year, basically, has stepped in and has decided to, at least until 2026, fund all of those recurring grantees of Open Philanthropies who were dropped because of this decision. And so that definitely doesn't solve the problem, but it's exciting to see that another grantor at least recognizes the sort of low-hanging karmic fruit there is here. Mm-hmm. And It's an open question whether they will continue to be active in all of the spaces that they're supporting right now. But the Navigation Fund, I believe, is building up its operations and deciding its strategy, and we'll revisit that decision toward the end of 2026. And we're hoping that they'll continue to be involved beyond that. But I think the biggest challenge that wild animal welfare faces from a funding perspective is that the foundations we've been talking about are the only multi-million-dollar donors in this space, and there's basically no funding directly available from sort of the traditional funders of basic and applied science. So I say no funding directly available because wild animal welfare questions intersect with many other questions that are funded in the context of biodiversity or just basic science about ecology or animal behavior or physiology. But no other funders have identified this as a high priority of research to fund. And so it's the effective altruism community and the farmed animal advocacy communities right now who are really carrying the load and pioneering this new area. We would really like to see more science funders come into space. And then as far as individual donors go, I think that this is something that is important to a lot of people who are currently primarily supporting conservation or other environmental organizations. And I think there's just a lot of folks that we could connect with there, and hoping we can build out our funding base there as well.
Yeah. For people who aren't like high net worth donors, but individual donors who, I feel like I often have this feeling of like, I'm not going to donate massive amounts of money. And that it feels kind of demotivating to me to try to figure out where to donate because my donation will be a drop in the bucket. How valuable is it for you to have a donor base in this kind of category of, I don't know, smaller donors?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It is extremely important. First of all, in the just sort of direct impact way, every drop that helps fill the bucket helps fill the bucket. I think we often anchor a little too hard on whatever the drops or splashes or whatever are that like cause the bucket to overflow, if you will. We're interested in those tipping points. Like, can I attach my name to this last thing that definitely happened? But in reality, there's just a lot of work to do. And, everyone who can help whatever amount along the way is advancing that cause. So it's not like the drop just evaporates out of the bucket. The funding matters. If you have something to give, we'd love your support. And then also strategically, smaller donors are very important to us because as a group, smaller donors tend to be a more reliable funding base. So as we were just discussing, Open Philanthropy is an incredible organization that has funded a lot of great work and made a huge difference. But understandably, the good ventures change their minds about what sort of things they wanted to be funding. That's something that any strategic donor should be able to do, right, is change your mind. And when the biggest donors move, that creates the biggest vulnerabilities for organizations like ours. And so when there are many smaller donors supporting us, we can look at that chunk of our funding and we say that, okay, we're not going to take anyone for granted there. We want to continue demonstrating the value of our work. And we understand that they may or may not continue to believe that we're a good investment going forward. But if any one of them leaves, that's not going to create a crisis the way it does when one major donor leaves. So it's surprisingly, there's this counterintuitive element to it where it's like almost by virtue of you not being one giant block underlying the whole thing, like you are adding a kind of security that can only come from sand. No, I don't know if that analogy works.
That makes, I mean, I don't know if that analogy works either, but the whole thing does make a lot of sense to me. And I do feel like, I don't know, I've seen kind of blog posts, and kind of arguments that like at various points, earning to give as a way to do good has become much less important. And then later it's become much more important. And maybe that volatility should make us just think that it is important, that the donations of people who are not, these like massive funders like Sam Bankman-Fried are offering this other thing that is not like always being the biggest mover of the needle, but isn't going to do the thing that Sam Bankman-Fried did, or that Good Ventures did here. And yeah, I think that's kind of a new way to think about it for me. So I find it helpful.
Yeah, that's a darkly hilarious instantiation of exactly this problem, where in this case, it wasn't just one organization, but a whole movement that decided to rely a lot on one huge funder. And then that huge funder pulled out, and the whole movement was left in a tough position. So, you definitely want to take advantage of large funds when they're available, right? I also think it's important to not be too cautious. And people were correctly, I think, pointing out when the FTX Foundation was funding lots of work that there was a need for more projects to fund. But I don't think that meant that other people should stop trying to earn to give. I think that's always going to be an important part.
Yeah. Okay, let's leave that there. So I think we kind of agree that one easy way to support work on wild animal suffering is to donate to Wild Animal Initiative. Another important way to contribute is, of course, through your career. Yeah. What kinds of people or talent does this field need right now?
Yeah. The newness and inherent complexity of this field means that it has a really broad surface area. There's just a lot of things you can work on. And I think as effective altruists, we're often in the mode of doing the back of the envelope calculation to find the one most effective thing. We've tried to do that for wild animal welfare. And for the most part, it's not that shape of thing. For the most part, it's something that you can come at from many angles. And so I think there are lots of promising career paths here. That's the first part of my answer. That being said, right now, the movement is definitely bottlenecked by empirical understanding of the scientific questions, which is why we've been talking about that so much. And so I would highly encourage anyone who is at all interested in a career in natural science research to consider whether they'd be a good fit for that. Wild animal welfare is inherently interdisciplinary field. The disciplines broadly that are kind of most central are ecology, animal behavior science, and physiology. So it's kind of connecting across those scales that's often most useful. And that's by no means the end of it, but broadly I'd say those are the areas most in need of work. And we need people in those areas who are excited about crossing disciplinary lines and working at multiple scales and, applying new frameworks. And if you are interested in a career in science, there are lots of pluses, but also lots of minuses to a life in academia. So that's definitely a question to take seriously, and that we could have a whole podcast on that alone. But I would say if you're interested in doing research to advance wild animal welfare, that I'd say is a extra reason to try out a life in academia if you can. Incredibly competitive, but this is an area where we're looking both for the object level understanding of the science and also the social and institutional building of this community. And so I think you can make a big difference by publishing a lot of papers. I also think you can make a big difference by hosting a journal club or organizing a workshop at your university. And we've been really, really lucky the last couple of years because New York University launched the Wild Animal Welfare Program, which is the first ever program at a university specifically dedicated to wild animal welfare. That's headed up by Jeff Sebo and Becca Franks. And it has been a real game changer for us to be able to work with an academic partner. I was excited to work on the nonprofit side of things because you can move so quickly. You have so much flexibility. You don't have to deal with all this bureaucracy, but they can deal with the bureaucracy, and we need some bureaucracy to get done. So all that is to say, the things that make academia annoying are sort of pluses for wild animal welfare if you're willing to engage with them.
Yeah, nice.
Okay, so that's the scientific side of things. Then there's the policy side, and the intervention side might be the other buckets. So policy, construing this very broadly, could be anything from federal regulations to state or local legislation, even to corporate governance. There's plenty of companies that have made commitments to certain green actions. If Unilever decided to take rat welfare into account, that would make a huge difference for rats. So bunch of different ways you can get at that. I think the policy space is unfortunately is quite constrained right now by the number of interventions that we have high confidence can work. But I still think there's a lot to be said for pushing for the things that we think might work, or helping build like decision-making systems that account for wild animal welfare. And the ideal is passing legislation and regulations that require the consideration of wild animal welfare and don't specify what that means. So, for example, many places have requirements about environmental impact statements that need to be produced before a major construction project can begin, for example. You could add wild animal welfare to a list of things that needs to be considered, and then that could be a sort of a structure to continually incorporate the latest wild animal welfare science into policy. I guess one more thing I'll say about policy is that I'm particularly excited about policy on more local scales for wild animal welfare. So I think the town and city scale in particular, and somewhat the state scale or whatever the equivalent is in your jurisdiction, is exciting because you tend to have more influence over what actually happens. And I think we're at a stage in the wild animal welfare movement where experimentation matters more than exploitation of the ideas, if you will. So it's less about doing more and more of the same thing and more about trying some things out or trying things out in several different places. And there's already been a lot of interesting work by cities on considering wild animals in their policymaking. The NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program and Guarini Center collaborated on a report about urban wild animal welfare policymaking. That's definitely worth checking out.
Cool. Yeah, super cool.
And then on the intervention side, again, I think different angles you can come at this from, but I think working at conservation and other environmental organizations, wildlife protection organizations can be a way to put yourself in a position to spread these ideas among people who are well positioned to be its most effective advocates and to incorporate wild animal welfare in other conservation or environmental activities. I'll say that I have maybe the fuzziest ideas here about what this will look like, but especially if you're early in your career, I think a few years down the road, there'll be more and more opportunities to leverage people in those positions. And since this is a field that is focused on change over the long term, I want to make sure we're not just looking down at our feet when we're thinking about the career decisions we're making. Another angle, finally, I would say on the intervention side would be looking at private sector approaches or other approaches to developing technologies. So, for example, there could be a lot of benefit to replacing rodenticides with contraception, or to even just taking existing poisons used for pest control, whether that's rodents or birds or insects, and replacing them with poisons that just act more quickly. Or sometimes there are mechanical alternatives or different crop strains or whatever. But when it finally gets to the point of here's an idea for what we can do to improve wild animal welfare, there's often either new technology that needs to be produced, or need to find a way to produce it more cheaply or at larger scales, or need to find a way to align it with market incentives so that we can actually get this idea off the ground. And I think there could be a lot of opportunities there. So it could look like developing technical expertise in mechanical engineering or biopharmaceuticals or what have you. Or it might look like just learning to be a great manager and capital raiser and, helping be one of those people who takes on the risk of starting one of the first startups that is producing products that will benefit wild animals.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. Many things, which is promising and exciting. Means there are lots of opportunities. I guess I suspect that, I have the sense that the field is very small, and I would guess talent constrained. What do you think holds people back from entering this field, even people who might kind of on paper be well positioned to make a difference?
When I see people who seem to be held back from participating in the field, the most common thing holding them back seems to be a sense that they don't know enough to contribute right now. And I think what people overlook is the fact that because we know basically nothing about wild animal welfare so far, if you know basically nothing about wild animal welfare, that puts you at the cutting edge of the field, right? We're all just making it up. I hope the rest of this podcast will prove that that's not literally true, but it's pretty close to being true. That's how I felt that was my excuse for not working in the field before I decided to apply for a job at Wild Animal Initiative. It's something we hear from a lot of scientists, and in the scientific context, it's often they understand one part of the problem, but they don't have the tools to measure or understand the other part of the problem. They understand the behavior, but not the ecology, or the ecology, but not the behavior, and that's just something that can often be solved relatively easily by collaborating with someone else. And then related to the idea of their not knowing enough is the sense that there's not enough that we can do right now. And this is tricky because I definitely don't want to overstate the possibility for short-term interventions, right? A lot of the point of this science is to make more things possible. But I also think that there's just value to trying things out and getting more constituencies involved, tackling problems from more different angles. At Wild Animal Initiative, we've theorized about how nice it would be if there were a pest control company that was, optimizing for wild animal welfare, but none of us are actually entrepreneurs. And so none of us are actually figuring out what the real constraints in that area are. So yeah, I think it's worthwhile to put yourself in a position to make change for wild animals, even if the position you're in the short term doesn't feel like the most impactful. And I guess what I'm advocating here is if we could quickly learn a lesson that I think effective altruism as a movement took a while to learn, which was, at the early days, I think there was a lot of thinking about okay, what's the one type of person that we most need right now? And it's okay, we need economists and computer scientists and maybe some public health experts. And then when it grew to the size of a movement, there's this growing sense of, if you're going to do movement scale stuff, you're going to need some agricultural economists and a whole bunch of managers and event coordinators and just people doing a whole bunch of different stuff, because you need people to do stuff.
Totally.
And these specialties became the rate limiting thing.
Yeah. Okay. To get people excited about this, what do you think is the best thing about working in the field?
This probably depends on what kind of person you are, but if you are at all a science or nature nerd, this is the place to be. It's you take all of natural science and then you just add this dimension to it, which is welfare. And there's just whole new space of questions you can answer. And it's so cool. And it's an excuse, a good EA mission-driven excuse to learn about shrimp and capybaras and crayfish and mink and otters and just the breadth of the field I find just incredibly intellectually satisfying and stimulating. And it's a place where I feel like I've gotten closer to the feeling of intellectual play that I have tried to deprive myself of since trying to become more mission driven. But this is a mission that requires a lot of playful exploration. And so that's probably my favorite part. It's just that it just is useful to learn about a whole bunch of different stuff.
That's awesome. Okay. One worry I'd have, partly just because in doing interviews about sentience in non-human animals, I've been feeling really sad about the scale of it. And I wonder if sometimes you or maybe some of your colleagues find it really depressing to think about these issues all the time.
Yeah, varies person to person, but I think that most people have a really strong tendency to underestimate their own ability to acclimate to things. I think you can kind of look at any depressing career or gruesome career or dirty job, whatever, and just the people doing the work just, are not as sad or grossed out or whatever as you would be upon first encountering it. And I think for a lot of people working in the field, that's their experience of originally facing the scary possibilities right in the face. And then that's the motivation to switch careers or change your life around or whatever. But then the deeper you get in the work itself, the less it becomes about the suffering of tens of trillions of shrimp. And the more it becomes about emails and deadlines and Google Doc comments, for better and for worse. So honestly, for me, I think working in the field is just the best antidote to worrying about the problem, because just at the end of the day, I can take whatever worry I have, and then translate into like, is this useful for me doing more work on my job? Like, is this changing my mind about what we should do? Or am I just like, having a little doom spiral here? And then if it's just a little doom spiral, like, do I want to keep doing that? And sometimes the answer is yes. Like I do really struggle with what the right balance is. I think personally, I tend to lean a little too far on the side of like detachment and compartmentalization. Compartmentalization is a really important skill. I'm now trying to find ways to bring some of the like compassion and grief back into my life so that it doesn't just feel like emails. So that's a continuing journey for me. But if you're worried about it always feeling daunting, then I think that's probably not going to be the problem that makes this feel unworkable for you.
Okay, that also, there's kind of some hints of guilt and motivation in there, which is a great segue to our final question for this interview.
You reached out with the loveliest email of all time to let us know that you got a lot from the chat Kieran and I had about free will and guilt. The rough idea is kind of that if you're sympathetic to determinism, it doesn't make sense to feel shame or guilt about the ways you're not a better, more productive, more moral, more anything person, because you are who you are and you can't be otherwise. Unlike free will, which says that individuals make choices, determinism says that all actions are kind of determined by prior causes, and there is no sense in which an individual is truly choosing anything. You are the product of your environment and your genetics, and you're not making the decisions that you feel like you're making. You're just going about living as your body dictates. Do you want to say what your experience with work-related guilt and shame has been like?
Yeah. Partly this is because my life is generally pretty good, but also it's partly because my guilt is so bad that work-related guilt and shame is by far the biggest source of suffering in my life. Like, just a kind of, maybe it's not every day, but it is almost every week. I feel really, just caught up in worrying about whether I've done enough or how bad it was of me to not do enough, or am I working enough hours? And there are varying degrees of this. It's an almost constant presence. Like a lot of my experience of my work day to day is like, remember, like you would be a bad person if you didn't do more of this. And then sometimes it has gotten so bad where I've like lost entire afternoons or entire days to sort of like procrastinating because this turns into such an aversive set of feelings. Once in 2020, this like kind of merged with my proclivity for depression to get bad enough that like I was, I think, a liability to the organization. And I asked my manager to like consider firing me and like lay out a plan for what improvement would look like. And then I got therapy and medication at just the right time, but like it can get really, really bad. So that is part of why it was so cool to hear an episode about it.
That's really, very, very moving to me. And thank you for sharing. And also, really, really wonderful to hear that the episode resonated. I guess some listeners had this worry that, and I relate to this, I feel sympathetic to this worry, that even deterministically kind of still assuming that free will is not like a part of the picture for how we do things, you still need guilt and shame to create the kind of determined motivation to be productive. Did you have any of that reaction, or do you have a way of thinking about that for yourself?
Yeah, that was definitely my inclination for a long time, like since I first started thinking about determinism, and then since I started thinking about it in the context of work, and then even after listening to the episode. And so it's only now with 3+ listens. Guys, it's a really good episode. If you haven't listened to it, highly recommend. Have I realized that, okay, so first of all, this might not apply to everyone. People vary a lot. But for me, like the bittersweet reality is guilt and shame just do not work at all. Or maybe they work sometimes, but there's a lot of times when they're just really, really counterproductive, when they make my experience of work so aversive that I end up avoiding work because I want to avoid the guilt and shame. And then, that just destroys the thing. So for me, for better or for worse, it's just simple enough. Like, no, this doesn't work. I've tried so many ways of trying to make this work, and it doesn't. The reason I think that this might apply to many or all people, or at least that I think it's really worth taking these ideas seriously and trying this out, even if it's not what you end up sticking with, is that guilt and shame, because of these reasons we discussed, or you discussed with determinism and free will, like they're just inaccurate feelings. Like they tell a story about the world that is not true. Like the story they tell is like, if I tried harder, then I would have worked more. And so then like you learn the wrong lesson, which is like, oh, next time I'm just going to like magically be a person that tries harder. Whereas if you step away from the guilt and shame and you just look at every, moment or hour as a retrospective, then you can actually identify the actual conditions or mechanisms that are leading you to be more or less productive. And you can notice like, oh, I noticed I was less productive on days when I was more tired, or on tasks that I enjoyed less, or when I was thinking about these other things, right? And those things aren't always in your control, but sometimes they're in your control in as much as you can ever control things. And yeah, I really feel like it has helped me just learn better how to set myself up for work. And yeah, I noticed too, there was something about like a sense of self or identity that the shame was reinforcing. It's like, oh, I'm not like, I don't know. It's something about like, I'm a person who cares so much. I only would have made this mistake if I wasn't trying hard enough. But actually the answer is like, no, I'm like a dumb meat machine that is subject to physical and emotional constraints. And I should just really learn how to work this machine, not like magically be a better martyr.
Yeah. I resonate with that a lot.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of this is it's a more useful way of thinking about things, but it is also a harder question to answer, right? Like the question of why didn't I work long enough or hard enough? If you just, because I just didn't try hard enough, bam, there's your answer, there's your certainty. And you give yourself this illusion at least of like knowing how to fix it next time. But dang, there are so many confounding variables when you look at how productive you are at any one day. And it's really frustrating to not know and like not have that sense of control about how to set yourself up perfectly the next day. But important work is worth doing and worth doing well, and worth, spending a while studying how you do it and what sets you up to do it well. So I think it's worth asking the more complicated question.
Oh, I wish we had another hour. I'm finding this super interesting and motivating, but I think that's where we have to leave it. Thank you so much. My guest today has been Cameron Meyer Shorb.
Thank you so much, Luisa.
Hi, everyone. A quick plug, because some of you will be listening to this around Giving Tuesday and might be thinking about where to donate. As Cam's already mentioned, Wild Animal Initiative is more funding constrained than they used to be because of the changing funding landscape that we talked about in the interview. So if you found any of this compelling and you want to contribute, you can do that by going to wildanimalininitiative.org/donate. All right. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced by Kieran Harris. Content editing by me, Katie Moore, and Kieran Harris. Audio engineering by Ben Cordell, Mile McGuire, Simon Mansour, and Dominic Armstrong. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together, as always, by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.